Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Please stand for the national anthem. You may be seated. The Jamaica Aid Support for Life welcomes you today to our public forum and research dissemination seminar on HIV and access to justice. This forum will focus on human rights violations faced by persons living with and affected by HIV and challenges faced in accessing justice under these circumstances. 40 years into the global HIV epidemic, the Caribbean remains the sub-region with the second highest estimated adult HIV prevalence. Available data indicates that new infections in the Caribbean appear to be stabilizing and HIV mortality is decreasing. However, some groups remain disproportionately affected by the HIV epidemic, including female sex workers, trans women, men who have sex with men, and people living with HIV. Unfortunately, stigma and discrimination, social exclusion, and lack of a supportive environment often limit the access to and utilization of comprehensive HIV prevention, treatment, and care services. It is a public health and human rights imperative that all persons, in particular the most vulnerable, have optimal access to health services to ensure the enjoyment of their right to the highest attainable standard of health. This, however, is not a standalone. The existence of an enabling environment, which is one that focuses on the physical, social, attitudinal, institutional, and legislative elements, is important for these groups to live with the respect they are entitled to because of their inherent human dignity. Today, we will engage representatives of these groups that can share their lived experiences. We will engage local agencies that provide care and support for these groups, both medical and legal. We will engage international development partners that continue to tirelessly support the work towards realizing a better Jamaica for the most vulnerable. And we will engage policymakers that have the power to effect the necessary policy and legislative changes to bring to reality this enabling environment of which we speak. My hope is that the months and years to come After this seminar, the changes that would have been realized will make today's engagement remembered in the annals of history as the turning point for HIV and access to justice. Welcome one, welcome all, and we look forward to a productive seminar. Thank you. Our presence here today could not have been possible without the continued kind support of the European Union delegation in Jamaica. So at this time, I will invite to the podium Deputy Head of Delegation, Ambassador Frederick Eichfeld.
Good morning, dear friends. I'm glad to be promoted so early in the morning. I'm not the ambassador. The ambassador is out of town, I'm afraid. So I'm here replacing her. But I've done so on many occasions before, especially in connection to highlighting the plight of LGBT groups. And I will come back to that particular aspect. So I will first let me say that it is my pleasure to be present here today at this important public forum for the dissemination of this report. I think it's highly important. The report in itself is important because it is a serious effort to document the situation. Now comes the difficult part, and that is to disseminate the content of it, to ensure that it's used and that others are made aware of it. But it's a very good start that it has been drafted, edited, and published. So it communicates the aims of the Jamaica AIDS Support for Life project to reduce HIV-related stigma, discrimination and gender inequality through the strengthening of community-based access to justice systems for key population and disenfranchised groups. You may already know that European Union and Jamaica have enjoyed a long period of cooperation together, which spans over a period of 40 years. In fact, we are celebrating this year 45 years of official relations between the European Union and Jamaica. On the 41st year of this cooperation, together with the government of Jamaica, the European Union signed the Jamaica Justice Sector Reform Program with the objective of improving efficiency of accountable, professional, and effective justice services. Also increasing fair access to justice services for all, in particular for vulnerable groups and at community level. Also, mainstreaming the national child diversion policy throughout the justice system and just avoid having young people getting incarcerated and having the stigma of having a criminal record. Strengthening linkages between justice sector institutions, also increasing budget allocations to justice sector institutions and programs, and strengthening public trust and confidence to the justice sector. I must say that today, I've been on the island for more than 2 years. I've seen what the European Union has done together with the Minister of Justice, and I must say that I'm quite proud to see how wise the money has been spent and how solid the Jamaican institutions are in absorbing the money and making good use of it for better justice for all. The European Union acknowledges the importance of civil society organizations, not only for the process of democracy, but as key agents who are best able to reach vulnerable and disenfranchised communities. Funding is therefore provided under all European Union programs, be it justice, public finance management, or forestry climate change, to support the work of civil society organizations to implement projects that support the respective program objectives. So this project that we have now is a good example of EU support. Without the civil society organizations, it would not be possible. The question is already asked repeatedly. Why is the European Union so interested in enforcement of human rights? Here I could do the long story. We don't have too much time for that, so we'll cut it short to the shorter version. But the European Union was born on the ashes of the Second World War. And we wanted to have a fresh start to ensure that it would never happen again. And against the ideas of coming from obscurity of fascism and National Socialism, we wanted to build a community based on human rights, based on the newly adopted Declaration of Human Rights in the UN of 1945. And this has been a red thread throughout the history of the European Union since then. The EU fundamental values are respect for human dignity, human freedom, human rights, freedom, democracy, equality, and the rule of law. These values unite all 27 member states. Therefore, the European Union actively promotes and defends human rights, not only within its border, but also abroad. In Jamaica, for example, within the last 3 years, the European Union has provided grants, contracts valuing over 525 million Jamaican dollars to support just the work of civil society groups working in the defense of human rights. 2 groups are directly involved in serving the needs of persons living with HIV, the Jamaica AIDS Support for Life and E for Life. In 15 days, December 10th, several countries around the world will be celebrating the 72nd anniversary of the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Jamaica is noted as one of the strongest supporters of the formulation of this declaration, and its substantial influences can be seen in the Jamaican Charter of Fundamental Rights and Freedom Act of 2011. But we all know that respect for human rights can still be improved, both within the European Union, but also in Jamaica. It's a constant battle. It's never over. Even if you reach high levels, there will always be dark forces trying to reduce it. So it's an ongoing battle that has to be done, involving notably the civil society organizations. The defense of human rights for all should be a collective concern. We need to come together, as you will do today, and beyond, to develop a collective solution that will improve the lives of key population in our own sphere of influence. We should remain positive that whatever little we can do could be germinated into a movement to leave no one behind and to treat all for our children and future generations. There are 2 key points that I would like to highlight from the report to be disseminated, especially related to access to justice as a fundamental right for all, and that is equality before the law and non-discrimination are core values and fundamental rights of the European Union. By our own experience, we at the European Union believe this should be the same for all democracies, and Jamaica is a strong democracy. In recent decades, legislative developments, case law, and policy initiatives have improved many people's lives and helped us build more equal and welcoming societies, including for key populations and for LGBT people. However, especially as the COVID-19 has eroded safety net for many, we believe that guaranteeing equal access to justice for all will, 1, fight discrimination through legal protection against discrimination,
which is key to advancing rights for all persons, including key populations and LGBT people, and ensure safety because key population and LGBT people disproportionately suffer from hate crime, hate speech, and violence, while the underreporting of hate crime remains a serious problem. Equal access to justice and protection through redress can therefore harness the potential of these vulnerable groups for the improvement of any society. I would like to stress here that I'm a European civil servant. I've been that for 23 years. It's in my obligation, in my mandate, to constantly promote human rights when I'm abroad, but also when I'm in Brussels. Special emphasis is also put when I'm abroad to promote LGBT rights. I do it because it's an obligation, but I also do it because of personal motivation. I think without equal rights for all, human rights don't have any value. I'm happily married, I have 3 beautiful children. I can tell you, if one of them came home, they're now in their 20s, and they said that, my son said that he would like to marry a man, I would embrace him and tell him, I will support you, and good luck, my son. From a personal perspective, I speak to you today not just as a EU representative, as I said, but also a parent. And this affects me personally, as I know that certain children are very emotionally distressed about the fact that they don't dare to talk to their parents and tell them who they really are. I really hope that this is about to change. And this is the last few words that I want to send you. But I feel particularly privileged to be here today. I have, throughout the years, participated in Montego Bay Pride March on 2 occasions. I met and discussed many from the LGBT community. I know how sometimes tough it is. And I can tell you that the European Union, we will do our share to at least to help you alleviate the burden. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Eichfeld. You know, as I listened, if you remember nothing from that presentation, remember he said, human rights are of no value if there is not equal access for all. That is something very important to remember. The Joint United Nations Program on HIV and AIDS have always been one of the key supporting partners of civil society in Jamaica in the fight to ensure there's equal access for persons living with and affected by HIV and AIDS. Today, we are pleased to have Community Support Advisor from UNAIDS with us, and I'm going to invite to the podium at this time to address us, Mr. Ruben Pages.
Thank you, colleagues, and good morning. Ladies and gentlemen, with all protocols respectfully observed, it is my great honor to provide an address on behalf of the Joint United Nations Program on HIV and AIDS, UNAIDS in Jamaica, and profound gratitude for the invitation to this important event. On the 3rd of July of 1981, the New York Times published a very brief but historic article titled "Rare Cancer Seen in 41 homosexuals. Hospitals began to fill with young people showing an unprecedented collection of symptoms that quickly worsened and led to their deaths. Doctors scrambled to understand what this was, where it came from, how to treat it, and what to call it. And the world's unpreparedness, unawareness, and ignorance about this new epidemic at some point led the scientific community at the time, in 1982, when referring to what we know today as HIV, to use the very harmful, inaccurate, and discriminatory acronym GRID, meaning gay-related immunodeficiency. After almost 40 years of HIV epidemic and response, 75 million HIV infections, and 32 million AIDS-related deaths around the world since the beginning of the epidemic, HIV is perhaps one of the most studied viruses in our history. Science and technology have come a long way, providing us with the necessary knowledge and tools to prevent new infections and deaths, only falling short of a cure or a vaccine. But we know how to prevent it, we know how to treat it, and we know how to care for those who live with it. We also know what puts people at an increased risk and vulnerability. The fact that we know all this invites us to look at the end of AIDS not as a scientific breakthrough, but as a moral imperative. Every single HIV infection and AIDS death is preventable. This makes the end of AIDS at this point in history an issue which is almost entirely about justice. What we mean by this is that one thing is not being able to stay free from HIV and save lives because humanity does not know how to do it, or that we lack the technical and financial resources to do it. And another very different thing is to be denied a service, be kicked out because of your health status, be criminalized because of who you are or not be recognized under the law, be excluded from your community, pushed to the margins of society and be left abandoned, empty, and unaccounted for, and suffer from poor health outcomes because of it. These things are not the virus. They are man-made. And action is no longer a hostage of circumstance as it might have been in the 80s. Today, action is a choice, and we are all accountable. Justice is at the core of the end of AIDS. We can fill countries with hospitals and doctors, condoms and pills, but it will have been mostly in vain if the people who need them cannot access them, if they are too afraid to leave the house or interact in public because of stigma, discrimination, and violence, if who they are is constantly subject to moral judgment and aggression, if society has pushed them to feel guilty or ashamed, if the law tells them that they are not welcome or does not recognize that they exist, if rights are violated and there are no consequences. And it does have an impact. So earlier this morning, UNAIDS launched our World AIDS Day report. It's titled Prevailing Against Pandemics by putting people at the center. One analysis in our report focused on available studies that have measured the negative impacts of stigma and discrimination and criminalization on HIV prevention, testing, and treatment. The analysis suggests that failure to make any progress on HIV-related stigma and discrimination would undermine efforts to reach our targets, resulting in approximately 440,000 AIDS-related deaths between 2020 and 2030, and 2.6 million additional new HIV infections over the same period. Now, sometimes we hear that it's tough, but that's just the way it is, and it will never change. But imagine if we went through life thinking and saying that it's tough, but it's just the way it is, and it will never change. UNAIDS resists. How can things not change if they depend entirely on us? Things do change, and we have witnessed this change. Jamaica has made a lot of progress in strengthening the enabling environment for people living with and most affected by HIV. And please allow me here to digress for a second and congratulate the government of Jamaica and its great civil society organizations on their successful participation at the recent Universal Periodic Review just a few days ago. We are extremely honored to be working in partnership with the Ministry of Health and Wellness and in particular the Enabling Environments and Human Rights team at the National Family Planning Board, and others through the partnership to eliminate all forms of HIV-related stigma and discrimination. We're also inspired by the efforts of the Jamaica Anti-Discrimination System, led by JM+, and other extraordinary efforts led by Jamaican civil society, including JASL, Jamaicans for Justice, Equality for All, and many others who have historically and bravely amplified the voices of the most marginalized, and keep working tirelessly for the rights of all Jamaicans and access to justice. And we must keep supporting civil society with technical support and funding. But we have a long way to go. In a few days, we will mark World AIDS Day under the theme Global Solidarity, Shared Responsibility. And it is perhaps a reminder that we are all affected by HIV directly or indirectly, and we all have a role to play. Just imagine the day when we will be able to say that AIDS is over in Jamaica. We are confident that this is feasible, and most of all, we know what needs to be done, and we have the tools to do it. But we need more will, more boldness, and more determination, and all of these depend solely on all of us. One of the most important steps to get there, of course, is precisely highlighting the reality with robust evidence that we can use to guide our efforts moving forward. So I commend all the partners who join efforts to make this report a reality, as I am sure that your commitment to expanding our knowledge and understanding about access to justice through your findings will allow us to have a rich, constructive, and very productive discussion today. UNAIDS remains committed to keep providing its support to the government, civil society organizations, bilateral partners, but first and foremost to the people of Jamaica as we keep traveling this long but inspiring journey of ending AIDS. We will get there together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ruben. The work that JASL continues to do, there are some key partners that have been with us all the way, that without their support, we could not have had some of the successes that we have had. And so before we continue, I just want to recognize with us today some key civil society partners. Eve for Life, Ms. Joy Crawford, please stand. Caribbean Vulnerable Communities Coalition, Mr. Ivan Cruikshank, please stand. Jamaican Network of Seropositives, Mr. Jamoki Patrick. He's somewhere around, I'm sure. Yes, his jacket is right there. Oh, he's being interviewed at this time. And I also have to recognize the HIV unit from the Ministry of Labor and Social Security, Mr. Conrad Saunders. Equality for All Foundation, Mr. Glenroy Murray. Mr. Javier Nelson, I think that is him behind the column. I'm only seeing the socks. And of course, from the Ministry of Health, the National Family Planning Board, Director of Enabling Environment and Human Rights, Mr. Devon Gabriel. All of these are both civil society and government partners that have been very supportive in the partnership with JASL for us to have had some of the accomplishments that we boast today. At the helm of the organization for the better part of a decade has been a strong leader that has guided us through, they normally say thick and thin, but thin and thin and thin and a little thick. But her sterling leadership has helped us to stay afloat, as I said, for the better part of a decade. So at this time, to bring an overview of this forum and the Access to Justice research, I'm going to invite the Executive Director of Jamaica Aid Support for Life, Mrs. Candace Livermore.
Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I don't know who better half of 10 years old. I'm 15, so I don't know at what point I would have had. It is with a profound privilege this morning that I am here to give you an overview of our Access to Justice initiative as it goes to the heart of what JASL stands for. First of all, I would like to thank the European Union, who would have provided the well-needed funding for us to advance this piece of work, and that this event could be hosted for us to share the findings. And we are very grateful, because this is usually the body of work that is left behind. So, almost 30 years ago, we are celebrating 29 years of Jamaica Aid Support for Life. A group of friends responded to an individual who was HIV positive. And they responded because the rights of that person, they were not being affirmed. This individual was not able to access health care, and in instances where they went, they were significantly discriminated against, and the friends were the ones who stood in the gap. And that is Jamaica Aid Support for Life. It is because of access to services, access to justice, why an organization like ours exists today. The numerous distinguished participants here show both a high interest in access to justice and a shared concern that there is an issue with access to justice for the most vulnerable in Jamaica. Over the years at Jamaica Aid Support for Life, through our work, the stories we hear are not just stories that make us say, oh God, oh my, and show the empathy and to feel. But there are stories that show us that there are significant structural barriers that prevent these groups from achieving optimum health. An inability to equally access the avenues, systems, and institutions of justice is one such barrier that must be addressed if people living with HIV and the key populations are to realize a Jamaica that denounces discrimination and have workable systems in place to address it when it occurs. Persons living with HIV and members of key populations also want to embrace the 2030 vision of Jamaica, the place of choice to live, work, raise families, and do business. A protective legal and social environment for PLHIV and LGBT people and sex workers are unfortunately not fully existent in Jamaica. And it is incumbent on all stakeholders to take a step towards ensuring that same becomes a reality. JASL has broadened its scope to ensure that we have a system in place to make representation and secure for key populations an environment that is fair and just. But this effort must be supported by policy, legislative, and institutional changes. As a civil society organization, from time to time, based on what we see engaging with individuals on the ground, we try to fill the gap. However, there is so much that we can accomplish if the framework does not exist. So JASL, we would have seen where some of these instances, they're just hard to grapple with. Making a report to a police if you are violated without fear or further violation is a challenge. Standing comfortably before a court to declare that your HIV status should not be the basis of discrimination. We need to assure people that the systems are in place to report, document, investigate, and bring a resolution to matters of discrimination. These are still not a part of the reality for persons living with HIV and members of the LGBT community in Jamaica. So this access to justice research highlights these and other challenges that PLHIV and other key populations face in their quest to access justice. The right to equality before the law, the right to equitable and humane treatment by any public authority in the exercise of any function, the right to freedom from discrimination on the grounds of 1, being male or female, 2, race, place of origin, class, color, religion, political opinions, the right to life, liberty, and security of persons, except in the execution of the sentence of a court in respect of a criminal offense of which the person has been convicted. All of these are guarantees under the Charter of Fundamental Rights and Freedoms that continue to elude persons living with HIV and members of the LGBT community. Access to justice is extremely important because if laws aren't implemented, people will never realize their rights. If justice isn't accessible, there will be injustice. And injustice for one is injustice for all. JASL continues to work to ensure that when we speak of justice for all, we indeed mean all. No one or group should be excluded or be left behind. Through engagements like these, we will continue to highlight the challenges being faced by persons living with HIV and other key populations to access justice. Through our continued engagement of policymakers, the justice sector, actors, and law enforcement officials, we will continue to be that voice. We will continue to fight to alleviate the challenges of access to justice for Jamaica's most vulnerable. I hope that this event will provide fresh insight and start a new dialogue about fixing the system to ensure that we have justice for all. We're looking forward to a productive day, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Livermore. You know, some of the things that we take for granted every day remains a challenge for LGBT people and persons living with HIV. You know, just getting up this morning and decide I'm heading to Halfway Tree, heading down the road, it's not something that we think about. It's just something that we do. But this is not the reality for people living with HIV and members of the LGBT community. So there continues to be the concern. I have to map out my route, where I'm going to travel today to ensure that I minimize the discriminatory comments that will be made when I pass, or I reduce the possibility of even being attacked. How I ask for some time off to keep my medical appointment, I have to be careful how I do that, lest someone think I'm living with HIV, and before you know it, I'm out of a job. These are still the realities of people living in Jamaica today. Mr. Saunders is sitting there from the Ministry of Labor, and he will tell you, we still refer cases to them where persons are displaced from their jobs simply because their HIV status became known among employees, fellow employees, and their employer. So we would have thought that after 40 years of understanding the HIV epidemic, these should be challenges that no longer exist. But the reality is they are. And it is the responsibility of all of us to take whatever steps necessary to ensure that we alleviate these challenges. Think about these things as we continue with the program. Now, the core of why we are here today is to disseminate the findings of the HIV and access to justice research, very detailed and some interesting findings that only confirm some of the realities that we see coming into our offices day after day. And many of our partners here can attest to this fact. So today, to present the findings, we have the Executive Director of Jamaicans for Justice with us. And I'm going to invite at this time Mr. Roger Malcolm to come forward and present the findings of this research. Roger.
Good morning. Hope you're doing well. So nice to see your faces. Well, some of you just your eyes and your hair, but nice to see your face, Candice. Okay, so when Jamaicans for Justice was approached to work on this project, the first thing I thought was this is going to be very hard. There's no data really anywhere. And so we had to get creative in compiling this data. So my goals with this presentation are not to run through the entire 104 pages of that report, or to recount all the data points and all the conclusions, but it's actually to leave you with the question as providers or advocates in this room of access to justice as an open-ended question. And as we go through, my hope is that we'll refine our own understandings of access to justice using a bit of what's in here. I only have 15 minutes. So as Patrick mentioned, I work at Jamaicans for Justice, and we conducted this research in collaboration with Jamaica AIDS Support for Life and JFLAG and Jamaica Network of Seropositives. And the methodology that is employed here is quite a mixed melting pot of official reports to these NGOs, key informant interviews, focus groups, surveys, and official records. And so let's get into it. You have the research in front of you. So the first thing I want to start with, and it's the next slide now, person controlling that, is that it's up here? Oh, I'm the person controlling that. Okay, great. So that justice for us is a thick concept. What does that mean, thick concept? Justice is not courts, it's not just laws, it's not just redress processes, but it's a concept that is purposive, procedural, and experiential. So let's break those three terms down. Purposive. So justice achieves something, and that something changes depending on the circumstances. It's not a courthouse or a lawsuit. It's to achieve something. That something is oftentimes restorative. For some people, it's retributive. For some persons, it is reparatory. But without a purpose, justice is not actually justice. It's just some process that has unfolded. Justice is also procedural. There are things that you have to go through to achieve justice. And that's oftentimes how we limit a definition of justice to the procedures, this person versus that person, this judgment. But it's also experiential in that someone can go through a process and not feel that they have gotten justice because of their experience of that system. And when we think about access to justice, we mean access to all these components of justice, not just access to some successful outcome between two lawyers competing for a prize in a courtroom. And when we think about justice that way, our responsibility to those seeking justice changes in quite fundamental ways, because we have to recognize that the experience of the person seeking justice is paramount, and the ways that we go about providing that justice have to accord with that. So a few points about how we can think about access to justice. One way to think about access to justice is that it's freely and equally available, regardless of status, ability, race, or level of education. And if that's not the case for a process and it's not justice, it may be a legal process, but it's not a justice process. Information about rights and how they can be enforced is readily available. That guided the study, and there's a part there about awareness of rights. Complaint avenues are accessible and safe, and I want to focus on that latter part, safe. When we get into a bit more of the findings, you'll find that many persons forego formal justice because they don't find formal justice to be safe. They don't feel safe going into a courtroom where they're going to be outed. They don't feel safe suing the person who did this to them because they don't want the retribution. They sometimes just want an apology. They want a different version of justice. And so the degree to which we expose persons to harm in giving them justice is a question about their access to justice. They earn the trust of marginalized communities who access them. That's a key feature of a just system. And that they're effective, timely, and they have reasonable and fair expectations, and then ensure all parties are to be heard. And so in this context, access to justice must be defined by the experiences of those communities oftentimes most excluded from the justice system. And their own desires of justice must shape how the state and us as civil society actors develop our interventions to increase their own access to justice. In many times, as a justice practitioner who isn't a lawyer, we have a conflict between our version of what people need and their version of what restores the best thing for them. And there are a few more points on what justice is. I'll allow for those to be passed. So the context. Most of you know the context. I'll give you 2 points on the context. On the PLHIV context, on the general context, we have differential experiences of key populations that require us to focus on their issues differently. The second is that we have limited use of conventional justice channels by these populations who have differential experiences. And we have pervasive negative social attitudes, which means that we're swimming against some tide. That's the context generally, swimming against some tide. So for the PLHIV, persons living with HIV, just giving some other research that predated this, a sample of 2,000 Jamaicans that was done in 2017, roughly just 1 in 10 respondents could demonstrate acceptance towards a person living with HIV, which actually declined from 2012. So in 2017, we saw a decline in acceptance of people living with HIV. So that's the social context. And in 2018, an assessment of healthcare workers and law enforcement found that incorrect and low knowledge of HIV was actually related to their attitudes towards people living with HIV. So even casual contact that persons may have had with persons with HIV, they perceived that they were at risk of infection, and therefore their actions were not just and accommodating. For just the numbers, as of 2018, Jamaica had 32,617 persons living with HIV and AIDS among adults aged 15 to 49. And the 2020 PLHIV stigma index, that's this year, of a sample of 500 persons, 48%, almost half, reported experiencing stigma and/or discrimination at least once in their lifetime. Around 1/3 reported stigma and discrimination in the last 12 months of the study. These both represent an increase from 38% and 15% respectively in the 2013 stigma index. So we're seeing negative trends in respect of both stigma and people's experience, but also how the persons who are not PLHIV have been recorded in their attitudes and activities. And then we have the LGBT context, and this is well known. I'm not going to spend much time on this, but a needs assessment this year found that 72.3%, almost 3/4 of the respondents in that survey, had experienced some form of violence in their lifetime. 1 in 5 had been homeless at some point in their lives, and 48% of those who were homeless were at once put out by their family members, in the immediate family member, and 43% were bullied. And then since 2011, JFLAG, the country's principal LGBT rights organization, had received close to 400 reports of human rights violations experienced by those members of the communities. So that's the context. I think it's fairly intuitive for many people. So reports to NGOs, that's what this study focuses on. It focuses on the part that we don't really get much data on, which is what's happening in the non-governmental space. And you may ask the question, why the non-governmental space? Well, that's because that's where most persons who are parts of marginalized communities report their issues, because there is a degree of alienation from formal channels. And so we decided to focus on what people who are connected with those experiencing the violations were receiving. And this is composite data from Jamaica Network of Seropositives through a collaboration with JFJ and another project, Jamaicans for Justice's own case research, Jamaica AIDS Support for Life case research, and some numbers from JFLAG. So reports to NGOs, here's what we have here on the screen. So this is a sample, N equals 298, which means that the sample includes 298 real reports of persons that persons made to NGOs over generally a 10-year period. And as we're seeing here, these are formal reports, and this is the first important caveat, but analytical point I want to make. Formal reports not equal experiences all the time. And so many times when we get experiential data from surveys, we get people reporting very different trends. But this is the first time we're able to parse down what did they actually report and what did we actually record. And so as you can see here, discrimination broadly defined, because it's 3 different organizations at the largest level, was the largest category of reports that persons made, followed by verbal abuse and verbal abuse, unauthorized disclosure of HIV status or sexual orientation, physical abuse, displacement, and employment discrimination. Displacement actually higher than physical abuse. And if you combine verbal abuse and physical abuse, you'd really get a category called interpersonal abuse, which would actually be the largest category. So you can think about it in 2 ways. 1, people treating people unequally and unfairly, discrimination, and those can be in institutions or in private settings. 2, persons abusing verbally or physically, persons who are LGBT or PLHIV, and that's actually the leading category when you combine those 2. Discrete acts of displacement, which are persons having to be displaced from communities or homes, and a specific PLHIV normally concern, which is the unauthorized disclosure of HIV status. And then we have a separate type of discrimination that was taken out because of how the data existed, which was employment discrimination. But if you add that to regular discrimination, you can see it would get quite large. Gender-wise, this data set included predominantly reports from women, which is interesting, accounting for 59% of the violations reported, men accounting for 38%, that's cis women and cis men. Unfortunately, the data going back that far did not collect persons of trans experience, so we're going with sex here, male and female, so 59% women, 38% men. The remaining 3%, the gender of the victim was not determined in the documentation. And so the finding here is that the majority of reports come from women. Why that is, it's not sure. We're not sure. It could be that the persons doing the peer navigation work or the redress work are particularly accommodating of women. It could be that women are experiencing greater human rights violations and they want to report it to communities. Or it could be that, just like with health-seeking behavior, women tend to seek out help more than men seek out help. We're not really sure. We have additional research somewhere in the study that helps contextualize that. But that's the gender disaggregation. So before I move from this slide, I just want you to take in the categories and where you see the trends, and I'm going to give a few case examples and move into some other variables for analysis. So let's look at a case example. This is Mary name changed. And we've thrown this case around a few times when we do these presentations. So Mary was working at a packaging company between 2011 and 2017, so 16 years. It was reported that on October 2017, rumors began to circulate that she was HIV positive. She actually expressed this to the human resource manager, who encouraged her not to resign at the time. But then in October, Mary was prompted to do a unprompted medical by the human resource manager stemming from the rumors. The company's doctor conducted the test. And the results were never shared with her. On December 11, 2017, they informed her that she would have to leave the job immediately, and she was made to sign a letter of resignation. She isn't fully literate, which she was not allowed to read and which she didn't receive a copy of. The matter was assessed by Jamaica AIDS Support for Life, referred to Jamaicans for Justice, and a process convened in the Ministry of Labor, and it's supposed to be going to the IDT, we hope. This is an example of when we speak about discrimination and what's wrapped up in there. That's an example. Another example is, these are quotes from persons in our focus groups and surveys who are giving their direct experiences, though they never reported these matters to NGOs. So this is someone who was working at a company, they had a staff event, And then at that staff event, it's informal, it's social. They're expressing their gender identity by how they adorn themselves, and then they were released from their position. So that's the context, the experiences that we're talking about. So reports to NGOs, the locations of incidents, and that looks quite small, so I may have to read that. So when we look on the location of where these incidents occurred, the community is by far the greatest space in which this occurs, but it doesn't mean that it's all by community members. So you have the community leading the charge, almost doubling, followed by a healthcare facility, and then closely together is the workplace and the home, separate from the community outside the home. A generalized public space, a school, a police station, a business place, a church, an NGO, or a court. This is where persons who reported to their NGOs reported that the incidents occurred. I have to remind us that the reports to the NGOs are one slice of the entire pie, but a very important slice. There's official reporting, which sadly the data just isn't disaggregated for anywhere for us to access. And so residential settings are dominating here. If you were to even add home and community, it would be double the next, the runner-up. And so what people ended up reporting is quite interesting, because through other survey data, even survey data in this research, people oftentimes list violations by police and at courts quite highly. And anecdotal reports suggest that those settings are the settings that persons experience quite a lot of this. And when we parse on a little bit more, what they really were saying is that those perpetrators were high perpetrators, but the settings that they experienced much of their violations were actually in the communities. And so that tells us that different perpetrators can perpetrate in different spaces, but it tells us that communities may not be safe for those persons that live there. Not feeling safe at home is oftentimes a refrain you get from working with PLHIV and KP clients. And so additionally, though, one of the reasons why the community would be so high in this study is because NGOs are oftentimes operating in social and community settings. And so you have someone who is your peer at the NGO that serves you. It is more likely that things that happen to you in a community setting are going to be things that you speak to that NGO about. This really has no judgment. It's actually an indication of where the potential comparative advantage of NGO work is, different from other institutions that wouldn't be that localized in a community. And, just to bring back one of the things that we had from that NEAT assessment this year of LGBT respondents, 1 in 3 respondents reported having a negative experience at the workplace because of their LGBT identity. And the most commonly reported experiences were verbal abuse, harassment, and discrimination. So you can see here just a difference between the survey data, 1 in 3 giving the workplace community the highest place, but that not being the case for the aggregate NGO data. So let's get some further context on not being safe in communities. So, there are 2 big points here. One, the majority of verbal abuse incidents and physical abuse incidents occurred in the community. So we're trying to figure out what type of thing is happening in the community that makes it so large. It's interpersonal violence. And then the second is that a significant portion of unauthorized disclosures were actually perpetrated in the community, which runs against conventional knowledge that that's normally happening in health facilities. So it's mixed between health facilities and communities according to data reported to NGOs. So the bottom line of this finding is that not all persons who fit this category feel safe in communities. And this feeling of being unsafe in communities was particularly bolstered by the focus group participants. And many of those had indicated that they suffer habitual, day-to-day, as Patrick was saying, going on the road, violence, whether verbal violence or physical violence in the communities, and that going about in a community based on their real or perceived sexuality, gender, or gender identity was the greatest threat to them. So that, just to go back to that slide, this big slide, doesn't want to go back. So that big number on community, think of those people as living in fear, so to speak. And that's important to figure out interventions for that large group of persons. No, it went. So let's go back. Thank you. And then we have another type of violence that is particularly interesting, which is not key population specific domestic violence, which is a considerable number of the cases that we had. So let's take this case example, for example. A female client was in an abusive visiting relationship. Her now ex-boyfriend regularly threatened her life and disclosed her HIV status to her friends without her consent. When the client was referred to the legal support officer at Jamaica AIDS Support for Life, she wanted to bring criminal action against her abuser. She was given some advice on her legal options, and they made a police report, and the police here actually warned the person, and her abuser has since left her alone, and there was nothing further needed. So it's giving an example there of sort of not something that is key population specific, but affecting key populations. Okay, perpetrators. So who is perpetrating this stuff? So the largest group, unsurprisingly for NGO reports, because, you report to the state normally violations by state actors. In the NGO space, it's not surprising that we see a complete flip of that, where the greatest violations being reported are by private individuals, but followed somewhat closely, 38% there, followed just 7% behind by healthcare workers, followed by employers, followed by law enforcement, and followed by employees where they work, which are also private persons, but we distinguish that because it's occurring in a workplace setting. And so it should be noted, however, this is a huge analytical point. Though there were these 298 compiled official reports, only 70% of the cases, people provided a description of who violated their rights, which is very common for NGO reports. People need someone to know, and they just want someone to know. This wouldn't be the case for official data from government, because you wouldn't even get your case recorded without knowing who it is. But in 30% of the cases, someone took it upon themselves to go and report without never naming a perpetrator. And this is because the NGO relationship is quite different than going to get bigger government redress. And that's something that is an advantage, and we should be aware of how we can use that. And so, of the number of persons, however, who reported that they had perpetrators, again, roughly 1 in 3 identified either a private individual, that's the 38%, or a healthcare provider, which is an astounding statistic, actually. If you look on all the reports, 1 in 3 coming from those who are supposed to give you health, or kind of just anybody else around. And so we're going to focus a little bit on the healthcare providers, because these private individuals are Joe and Jane Public. Their profiles and their features are unknown to us. But we know a little bit more about those who are employed in the delivery of healthcare. So, issues in health. So, let's note a few points about issues in health. Healthcare accounts for the most prevalent environment in which persons reported to have faced stigma and discrimination, and institutional settings generally actually accounted for 55% of the complaints. Let me take a step back and explain that last point. Institutional settings, someplace official, is half of all complaints, which is important to know. And then the most prevalent setting of those institutional settings is healthcare. And so healthcare facilities accounted for the greatest degrees of stigma and discrimination, and 1 in 3 reports of incidents. But what context can we provide to that? And our focus group participants help give us that context. So what did they think? The first thing that they thought was that they thought that no matter how much training occurs in health, people still need more training regarding particularly HIV, because they thought the knowledge was low, and that low knowledge led to harmful practices. But interestingly, there was a gender dynamic. So most of the men who were living with HIV in our focus groups and surveys expressed that they did not really experience stigma and discrimination because of their health status. It wasn't something that they found. It probably does occur naturally, but there's not much reports of it, and it's not something that was dominant in the focus group discussions. Instead, many of them indicated that they're more likely to be asked to leave their job if it was brought to the attention of their employer, and these tend to be PLHIV, LG, and gay men. And so that's interesting context, that this may be a gender dynamic that is affecting women disproportionately. And you have to find out that's an interesting finding, given that women already dominate the data set. Here's an example of what one person said, and you can read it there. Is left, we should have left you upon the bed, make you lie down in the bloody bed, is so you people, HIV people, stay when you come in here with your sickness and you just want to dash it everywhere, right? So that's obviously a quite demeaning engagement that this person reported as part of the research. Another person said, I was being treated. Oh, sorry. My bad. Yeah, so we can just read that one there. I thought you were reading along. So you can read it to get more effect than my very lazy read of that. Great. And then so another person was being treated at KPH and was told point blank by the doctor that they could not get the therapy because of their status. and you have the quote there, was told that the instrument that was used for the therapy was not to be reused, but because they were expensive, they always reused them, and they would not run the risk of using it on her and then on another patient, because, it could never be sterilized or anything like that. And then we have, in March, this person went to the clinic, and upon arriving, security was shouting out loud for the different departments, asking who was going to what department. And when this person went up and told the security guard, I want to go to the social worker, she was told to stand to the side. Another girl came up a few minutes after her and was allowed through, and security guard responded, you two stand over there because he knows what they're here for. Probably adherence counseling, probably some type of social work that comes with the treatment plan that allows for them to be profiled effectively. And then finally, this person, when I was first diagnosed to be HIV positive, this person reports going to a healthcare facility where each time a patient or any individual will come in, they would point and say at the end of the clinic, this is where all the HIV persons are. Each time they come in, it's like my confidentiality, this person reports, is not being secured. So, what are the insights here that we can take away from focus groups? That we can have those numbers, but it's the people's experiences that tell us how to do interventions. So one, experiences where persons were denied access to medical treatment due to their status, as well as incidents of substandard treatment received in childbirth particularly, are two unique issues that affect the PLHIV community, among other many issues. This is what the focus group said. And then particularly women here, you see an issue of women and health. It keeps coming up. Many women living with HIV express experiences of unauthorized disclosure, denial of services, and substandard treatment. Their male counterparts continue to experience more discrimination and verbal abuse in comparison to other violations. And that's just the insight to take away there. And so women health, that's a connection we have to explore, or men and health underreported is also something we need to explore. So I go back to the perpetrators for a bit, just so you can refresh yourself on who we're talking about. Private individuals, healthcare workers, we've done healthcare workers. Let's talk a little bit, we can't talk about who the private individuals are, but we can talk about what they do, because that's all we have. So here's a case example. A client at Jamaica AIDS Support for Life who receives clinical and psychosocial services had been in an on and off relationship that was abusive. She had made numerous reports to the police, and she had received no redress. Due to the stress, she was having a difficulty adhering to her HIV treatment. Again, this is a theme that we have to remember. She was referred to the HIV-related legal services program of JASL, where after consultation, he was connected with one of JASL's private attorneys, an interesting model that JASL has employed, partner attorneys, and he was able to apply for a protection order from the court and move the abuser out of their home. This is an emblematic case because this is also in our experience at JFJ. We have a lot of these cases. We found that in many cases, women and private actors are involved in some custody and maintenance issue related to children. And arising from these cases, the private actors weaponize the complainant's HIV status to dissuade them from pursuing justice against them. That's a really big thing. We've had many of these cases. A person tries to take action, and you see many Facebook posts about the AIDS girl, and then she says she withdraws, and she doesn't want to do it anymore. But additionally, the perpetrators utilize the victim's status to suggest that because they're HIV positive, they are unfit to be mothers, and the court should take their children into state care or give it to them. And it's oftentimes a very bitter and nasty fight. And so that's a very interesting example. But we found that formal justice in these types of contexts are actually comparatively more effective than formal justice in other types of contexts. And it's because it doesn't really require the status to get involved to get a protection order. You just have to deal with all the mess of the family court. That's its own conference. So another act by private actors is particularly as it relates to LGBT persons. And I have a few quotes here that just give you what participants had reflected in the study. At the age of 14, this person was beaten and abused by their family members because they perceived them to be gay. Another person heading home from an event was attacked and beaten. He ran and fell, and 2 policemen came over, and he thought they would assist him, but they didn't, according to his report. And this is coming from a woman now. Their partner looks like a man, and when you walk together, you can read the quote. I probably can't say that because it's being streamed. And so they try not to walk together, but they're still verbally abused. And so for them, it's a no-win situation, right? And so what does the research sort of tell us in these two examples of, well, the domestic violence one before, I should say, actually. So procedurally, the system works better in domestic violence settings, though there are major gaps. However, and this applies to all types of interpersonal violence, where the police or the court gets involved, many times perpetrators just breach what the court or the police say, and there are oftentimes no sanctions. And this indicates that redress options on their own, formal justice, are just not going to be sufficient, which is why we get to a further slide on why more and more complainants don't want formal justice because they don't view it as effective. So a few insights here on experiences with the police. So there are three big issues. One, and this is very key population, PLHIV, LGBT specific. It is very unique to this population. Unwillingness to take complaints seriously, especially when they come from LGBT persons. In several cases, police even use their criminalized status of, I guess, being LGBT as an excuse not to treat the report seriously. This also affects sex workers, who are a minority of the cohort of this research. Additionally, with one of the things we've had with police, which we've had some headway on in prisons, but not really in police lockups, is denial of medication to PLHIVs who are in police lockups, even when the status is known, and this is life-saving treatment oftentimes. In several instances, denial of medication was coupled with the complainant being called derogatory names. In many instances, our lawyers have a few of these where the issue is just getting them bail so that they can get back on treatment without even worrying about any criminal defense. And in one instance, a complainant was called the AIDS man for the remainder of his stay in lockup. And then the third is very simple, abuse of power. And so we look at an example from a female sex worker, and I'm just giving some insight particularly on the police here because they're a gatekeeper. So a female sex worker reported that two police officers had drove up to her and demanded that she get into the vehicle. When she inquired as to why she should get in, she was reportedly pepper sprayed. This is her report. She maintains that she is too fearful to report the incident to anybody but to disclose it to her NGO, and is having trouble finding the video evidence of the interaction that her friend had recorded. Due to her unwillingness to report, there is no legal redress available to her. But what she did receive was legal literacy training to better understand her rights and educate other sex workers. And this is a very common example. Something bad happened to me, I'm telling you, but please don't ever report it. I don't want more bad things to happen to me. Very common issue you face for persons who work, quote unquote, underground. Another, this is a woman who, slide, oh, thank you. You just bawl it out louder earlier, can they see? So that's that slide that I just read. I won't linger too long on it, but that's a sex worker. And that's her report. And this is obviously, we can get this because there's no prospect of it ever getting to the formal justice system. So they open up a little bit more. Hope you got a chance to read that. So another is a woman who was being abused by a man known to her. The police were called up when, they dismissed her as being a mad lady, and they threw her personal items out of the building. When the client made a report to the superior officers, it got nowhere for her, and she has continuously gone to the station to investigate, and she gets chased out of the station. Another, this is a direct quote here, late one night, this person is driving home, they get pulled over by several police officers. This is a woman, this is a female whose gender expression may be masculine. They were told to come out of the car and said he was going to search. This person told that, well, I'm a woman. However, the male police officer had slid his hands under the clothes and touched her vagina. They confronted the officer about the actions, and he proceeded to use obscene language, according to this report. And the police took away the papers for the car and demanded that they follow, that the person drive behind them. And that's where we ended in terms of that quote, because there's some other stuff that's not going to be on the slide. And so, what are the insights that we can take away here, particularly from the focus groups? LGBT participants, when compared to PLHIV, this is a more of an LGBT predominant experience, shared more experiences of physical and verbal abuse from police officers and other citizens than PLHIV participants did. And both men and women reported experiencing physical and verbal abuse by police officers if they were perceived to be, out and gay, not, this is okay, but if you're flashy, and so on, so then you're going to get it. Several LBT women, that's lesbian, bisexual, transgender women, shared their experiences of being sexually abused in some cases by police. And all participants of the LGBT focus group stated that they were often referred to or spoken to using homophobic language. And just to give a little bit of context for this, we had done a rapid assessment at Jamaicans for Justice of 418 police who were doing some training on. And while at the end of it, the data ended up looking really good, so I want to give kudos to those police trainees who were in our training. But at the start of it, 82% were unable to identify a single law that protects people's rights in Jamaica, though we got them on month 4. And 14%, I could identify only one legislation that was a charter. The charter was cited for less than 10%. And so just to indicate this is the context that we're going into, probably limited attitudinal reform work happening before you go into service. So, Candace, you're letting me down, man. See, I missed the slide again. But this is that slide there. And so that's the context that we're working on, and that helps give a sense of the institution different from the person. With the institution, you can intervene with a captive group of duty bearers. With the person, it's sort of generalized societal transformation. So, desire for redress. What did people want? We have this whole redress sector. What did people really want? We have a very broad definition of redress. If they want something, they want redress. Okay? That's how we divide. That's how we determined it. So 7 in 10 individuals who experience discrimination or human rights violations are likely to seek some type of redress, right? And therefore, what that means is that the system, and this is the NGO system, needs to be equipped to provide redress to at least 3/4 of the persons that complain to them. Let me repeat that. 3/4 of persons are going to want some type of redress. Therefore, the system has to be able to do something, that load for 3/4 of the persons that come. We're not really ready for that, just straightforwardly. JFJ struggles with that, JN Plus works on that, JASA works on that. But if we were to really say 3/4, we're going to definitely provide some tangible thing for, with lots of work to do. So consider the majority of persons who reported their cases desire to pursue redress. It's key to align the landscape with the realities. And so there are a number of factors that impact access to justice. They're in the study, but a few of them include how confident people are in the system, the complexities of the system, the cost of justice. It's not cheap all the time. And no, it's not a slide this time, Patrick. I have notes, and I'm just reading from them. And the threat, and you see, you make me lose my train. And the threat of corruption are things that research tells us, particularly research in sub-Saharan Africa with similar rates, tells us are statistically related to likelihood of redress. This is now a slide. And so, great. What did complainants ask for? So, hopefully this is visible. But that big one on the bottom, they wanted sensitization with the accused/community. That's what most people who reported to NGOs actually asked for. A very close second, just 7 points behind, so it's in the margin of error, you could say they're equal, wanted formal legal services. They wanted things to be done, lawyers to be, courts to be convened or whatever, and they wanted justice in a thick, formal, procedural sense. A smaller group wanted social assistance. This is an increasing number, actually. They need social assistance. They don't really care that much about retribution. They just need, listen, I've been wronged, can you help me? The other set wanted counseling, and then a smaller group wanted conflict resolution, compensation, report to the police, referral for medical care. And so, almost equal are the desires for formal justice and for alternative justice, which presents a beautiful opportunity, because this is something that Jamaica as a country has been trying to balance more, the uptake of restorative and alternative justice modalities. Well, people who report to NGOs represent an opportunity to upskill the NGO space to tap into restorative justice modalities, because that's what the people them want, right? They don't just want formal justice. And so, there are high prospects for form restorative justice, but still high need for pro bono legal services. Because if the second highest, just by a margin, is asking for legal services, who funds that? Legal aid doesn't do that unless you're accused of a crime. Public defender provides great assistance investigatively, but has a limit of a constraint in taking legal work. So right now, those who provide that are principally Jamaicans for Justice and Jamaica Aid Support for Life and a few others, and JADS through their anti-discrimination system run by JN Plus allows for referrals to different partners. And so right now, the NGO space is better equipped than the state space to provide legal services because the state provides no real legal services. And then complainants who indicated that their desired redress option to be that of sensitization, which is 49% of the whole cohort, so roughly half, indicates that most people are seeking behavior changes as it pertains to their alleged perpetrator, but they also oftentimes are a little afraid of the formal justice. So that's really why you could see that number being, that bottom one representing 49% of the overall group as being the way it is. And as it relates to legal services, if we think about it this way, at 45% or 1 in 4, then we need to expect 1 in 4 of people who come and complain to NGOs may need legal services. NGOs need to align their services to provide that. But the biggie, 35% of persons actually, when you add it together, wanted some type of psychosocial assistance, whether it's counseling or conflict resolution, and a little form of social assistance when you look on the different cases. That's 1 in 3. That's actually a very interesting area because this raises concerns as to whether our present providers of redress are managing the expectations of complainants regarding their ability to provide psychosocial and therapeutic services. Very few are doing that at a scale. Jamaicans Justice barely does that. Groups like E for Life have a therapeutic background. JASL has, case managers. JFLAG has social workers. And so that may be a need that we may need to explore a little bit more. Most service providers are unable to provide social assistance when we did the key informant interviews to the scale that clients want it. And therefore, the needs are going to largely not be met to the scale that they're being demanded based on our analysis. And so the question really is, can the sector adequately provide psychosocial assistance for at least 35% of complainants seeking redress? That's a big question. I don't know what the answer to that is, but it's a question that needs to be contended with. And so here's a quick case example. Thanks. This is John, name change, obviously. He was a victim of constant homophobic and HIV-related harassment levied against him at the security guard at his place of employment. This is a success story, so to speak. This was due to the perception that he was gay, living with HIV. And so following his referral for legal support, what happened here was that the legal support officer at Jamaica Aid Support for Life had written to the employer detailing the treatment and reminding them of their responsibility to provide a safe and healthy work environment. And eventually the security guard was terminated and the person retained in employment to this day. And so that whole modality of intervention can present formal outcomes even if formal processes are not commenced. So I want to wrap up shortly with some of the perspectives of redress providers. So for some persons reporting, as I mentioned, redress just means an apology, a warning letter, or some other less adversarial process. From the Ministry of Health and Wellness's representative who was participating in the study, they indicated that persons want verbal and written apologies, and they have gotten them, in their opinion. From representatives at Jamaicans for Justice, where I work, normally the majority of persons want us to warn perpetrators, as you can see from this quote coming from one of our attorneys. And then we said, okay, these are formal reports. We have some perspectives. Let's survey the population, even if they didn't have a report to make, to find out what the general key population community thought about where you go if something bad happens to you. And this is very interesting because it's actually the opposite of what the formal reports say. So when we ask persons in survey responses, where can you get redress if some human rights violation happens to you? The leading place was the police, 30%. Now, if I go back to the desire for redress slide, and you see stuff that the police offer are not really represented much in what complainants want. Police offers criminal accountability, maybe some restraint of a perpetrator. So when we ask people, where can you get redress? Roughly 1 in 3 reporting the police, and then the rest of them reporting NGOs. We don't actually have any state entity represented in the survey responses. Now, one would expect that you put a survey out, if something bad happens to you, where do you report among community members? First report is police, the second is JN+, JASL, JFJ, JFlag, Transwave. I don't know. Nowhere I wouldn't report. And so that's really interesting. It's not the whole population, but it's indicative of within the community, how the community views formal, big government as redress outside of just the police. And so then we ask persons, a notable number of participants expressed that other than the police, they were not aware of any organizations that would assist them if they experienced discrimination, even though you see a good number of them stating the NGOs. And so we asked then persons, how did you become aware of these entities? Most were word of mouth. The others were social media, a few from TV, newspaper, and radio. And so the fact, this thread that you keep seeing, word of mouth, community, peer-to-peer, is demonstrating that when NGOs are providing redress, it is through direct connections. It's largely through the human connection that comes with delivering NGO services. Our recommendation is that that modality should be explored, studied, and turned into an actual method, because it's actually what works for the provision of NGOs. Putting out ads and that kind of stuff about we do that kind of stuff is nice, but most people care about NGOs and come to report to NGOs based on word of mouth. And then, so why did some people not seek redress? This is not just from our case reports of persons who were in the focus groups and surveys who said, this happened to me, I never reported it, so you're never going to find my case in your study, sir. Well, why some people don't pursue redress is they want to just move on. That's a very common thing. They don't care. They just want to move on. I am bothering you with this whole make a report, please. I just want to move on and live my life. The next is there's a distrust of the courts and law enforcement, oftentimes. And then even if they trust the court, they're very fearful that the court process will expose them further. Those are the 3 big threads. So the desire to move on. What did we hear there? Many respondents did not want to dwell on their case. They called it dwelling on their case. And that the delays in the justice system would prevent them from getting their redress quickly, and they want to move on with their life. And that's a common thing that you see here. I doubt you can read that. I'm sorry about that. And a Jamaica AIDS Support for Life rep had indicated that the time it takes to decide on the redress path that the client can pursue is perceived as too long by clients, and that deters them from pursuing justice. A J-Flag rep had indicated that people don't want to report to the police because they can't bother. That was their experience. And that this person from J-Flag thought that it's especially pronounced inside the community. And a rep from Jamaicans for Justice had indicated, upon reflecting on the cases that they were managing, that most of the cases that they had so far, people are reluctant to go all the way with the court process. Very common thing. So on the issue of distrust of police, as we see as a theme, and I'm wrapping up here, what we call LGBT community particularly was the most redressed averse when compared to PLHIV members of the community, because most participants perceived that if they had to interact with the police, they would not attain redress. And so you find that LGBT persons particularly were very averse to getting any redress. Even if their redress didn't require the police, they just assumed it did. And that was an interesting perception that became a self-fulfilling prophecy. And then the quote here that's at the bottom is quite interesting, because it just says that they believe that police don't give them justice, and therefore they're going to seek justice from NGOs. Okay, and then the other theme of fear of disclosure, what we found here from a JASL rep is that the quote is very instructive. I find a lot of persons want something to be done, but they don't want it to expose them any further. That's a big thing to get to that question that I asked at the start about if justice mechanisms are safe. And oftentimes as practitioners, the conflict is discerning whether the vision of justice being proposed is consonant with the principle of doing no harm. I want to get you in court. I believe that we need to have a court judgment and a win, but this issue of if it's safe is important. And so we wrap up with what justice meant to the respondents. And I love, this diversity of what justice meant to them. For one person, it said, the freedom to be myself and access to society. That's justice. That's a very transcendental, pervasive, thick view of justice, general freedom. Having the same rights as everyone else, and that these are observed by the system. Some person was specific, the need for an anti-discrimination legislation, that's justice to them. The fourth person, the need to access shelter because I had been displaced, and unless we address the social issues and needs of the individual, there's a fundamental issue with access. And then the last person, why health facilities fail to provide basic standard of care is unjust. So these are all word-of-mouth responses or typed-in answers, but you can see the different ways that the justice question is being answered, and therefore the different ways that the NGOs and those providing justice have to be able to meet that answer. So I leave you, colleagues, with a few questions. My first is, in our work, how can we honor the multiple components of justice for those who desire it? Just let that be something you answer over the next year. Oh, thank you, Candace. In our work, how can we honor the multiple components of justice for those who desire it? Honor it. That's really a question that we have to answer if we say we're doing justice work. The next question is, do we privilege and impose a version of justice on those who need it? And finally, in our different spheres of influence, how can we promote more just outcomes, whatever that looks like for your sphere of influence? I think if we can answer those questions in practical and pragmatic ways, we'll be many steps closer to access to justice in a meaningful way for those who need it. Thank you for your attention. I am finished. I am to stay? Oh. Stay at the podium? Or am I sitting on the podium?
Good morning, everybody. I always find it interesting when Roger makes a point of saying that he's not a lawyer, because I find that his analysis of content of law, the impact of the law, the implications, and his recommendations for law reform are much more articulate, concise, and understandable than those of almost any lawyer I know. So,
I appreciate that.
So I'm Dion Jacksmiller, so I'll be doing a little Q&A in this segment with Roger, following on the situation analysis that he just summarized for us. Now, I should say, although I can ask questions from now until tomorrow, from here until the end of the program is really supposed to be very interactive. So feel free at any point to just indicate and jump in. There is a roving microphone. Somebody will be able to bring a microphone to you. I see a hand up already. And so we will be doing this for about 15 minutes. About 15 minutes. About 15 minutes, and then we'll go into our first of two panel discussions. And again, you're certainly invited and urged indeed to ask questions all throughout. Just before I go to your questions now, I thought that you did a great job, Roger, in terms of painting a picture of what the situation is. One of the issues you didn't get to, no doubt because of time, was the recommendations, yes, some of which would no doubt answer a lot of the questions that you were asking there. One of the recommendations is for legislative reform to fill gaps in the law. Mm-hmm. How important is that recommendation? How important is legislative amendment, given the concerns you've expressed about the effectiveness of the formal justice system in meeting these needs?
Thank you, Dion. It's very, very important. And if I could explain its importance in two ways. So the first is, there are things that, there are things that you just can't do because there isn't a legal framework for it, right? That's just the first level. you want to hold someone accountable for X thing, there isn't a legal framework for it, and therefore the availability of redress is constrained. And so if we are to provide greater access to justice, one way of creating access to justice is creating modalities to hold people accountable or for just legal redress. So for example, we don't have a comprehensive anti-discrimination law in Jamaica, whether as its own statute or how the provisions of our constitution are formulated. That just constrains how much the law can do to respond to discrimination. But the second way that it becomes very particularly important is in institutional reform and changing the behaviors of persons. So when we made it a crime not to report child abuse, people got scared not to report child abuse because, you know, you could go to jail for not reporting child abuse. It doesn't even have to deal with carrying someone to court for not reporting child abuse. The fact that the law now said this is the authoritative norm in our country, this is the compellable legal standard, therefore your behavior must change. And the law signaled that children are deserving of protection and the law is compelling you to protect them even if you didn't have anything to do with it.
So in this context, what for you would be the most important legislative amendments needed?
I have a very hard time answering that question because it's from just where I sit, but I would say one is systemic. I think Jamaica needs a national human rights institution because that would be a systemic response as opposed to me picking out and say, I really care about discrimination, pass a discrimination law. I think if Jamaica had a national human rights institution in compliance with the international standards that could protect and promote human rights by violations by both private and public actors, that would be the most worthwhile systemic response.
I saw hands up already, so.
My name is Michael Williams. I'm an attorney. The test case with Mary jumped out at me. And it jumped out at me for several reasons. One, this is somebody who is employed and she's referred to a doctor for a test. And she is tested by doctors who then pass on her results to her employers in total violation of what their ethical and legal obligations are. So that is shocking for me, that members of the medical profession, I'm not talking about lab workers now or the technicians, I'm talking about the doctors, would pass on her results. And there is certainly something that redress that Mary could get in the formal system and should be pursued. But that raises the issue of public advocacy law. What is absent from Jamaica for me is we don't have much funding for public advocacy law. That jumped out at me first when I participated in the West Kingston Commission of Inquiry, where the government financed the attorneys for agents of the state, the JCF, the JDF. But the citizens who were complaining against the state could not fund my presence at the commission. So we need somehow to find ways of funding public advocacy law. Restorative justice.
Finally.
I find that generally, most Jamaicans, I'll skip that one. Let me go to redress. Since I've been in practice, I've assisted 2 Jamaicans to go overseas. There's sort of a little underground railroad of people who want to get refugee status in other countries. You're not going to get it if the actors are private. But if you can prove, particularly for Canada, that it is the state actions like the police that are systematically violated your rights, you stand a better chance, just for people to know. And people should actively consider, if they can't live here because of what is happening to them, and it's repeated, to seek refugee status elsewhere. It will embarrass the state, and the state will be more interested in taking action.
All right, thank you so much. Can I just pick up on something, a point Michael made there, Roger, in terms of the public advocacy issue, because the Office of the Public Defender, of course, had in fact been represented at the West Kingston Commission of Inquiry, and the idea of a national human rights institute, I think at least initially, if not now, had been a transformation of that office into that institute. Would that address the concerns that were raised there?
Well, that was going to be my answer, so thanks. Yes, it would address a large part of those issues because, so the public defender is like half to 3/4 of a national human rights institution, but there are very strict requirements to comply. One of them would be the ability, if we do it, to provide that type of legal support to persons who need it, because our legal aid regime is really criminal defense regime. It's not legal aid in a true substantive way. So a national human rights institution would really help address that particular issue. It could do advocacy, and it wouldn't need to, like the public defender did when they tried to join the Buggery case, get thrown out by the court because advocacy litigation is not their role. A national human rights institution would be empowered to do this frontally, right? And that's important. And additionally to your point on Mary, I know a little bit more about Mary's case. One of the big debates in that case with Mary is about elaborating potentially the jurisdiction of the IDT, because there was a debate with the Ministry of Labor if constructive dismissal, which is alleged to have occurred with Mary's case, is something that the Minister of Labor ought to refer to the IDT. So it then got kicked to the AG's chambers. And so Mary is waiting for the AG, you know, and that got quite complicated. So again, there's also an issue of law reform there, Dion, because this is an issue where we can all see someone needs to be able to decide it. But the system can't decide where it goes because the legal channels aren't clear and precise. Another way that we can optimize those things is through law reform.
Okay, great. Question?
Thank you. Just curious, in your discussion with the community, did the conversation about criminalizing disclosure or HIV come up? Because I know just talking to persons, and when we were very vibrant, that thought of disclosure would have prevented me to seek justice or exposure. Did that come up any at all? And if so, how do we manage that as we're asking about reform and justice if we're having another conversation to turn me into a criminal?
Yes, we do not want that. And so, Joy, excellent question. It came up, but it comes up more from advocates and organizations than from the people experiencing, because it's viewed as, oh, other jurisdictions have some type of criminalization of disclosure, therefore that's our solution to it. But it doesn't come up as a recommendation as much from persons who you speak to unless they're exposed to it already. So that's just something that's interesting. However, I think if we could switch the language from prescribing the type of regulation from criminal law to just saying the legal framework should address prohibition of disclosure, I think it would be easier. So here are 3 options we've seen so far. 1, cybercrimes, which I think is a terrible approach because it actually enlarges the Cybercrimes Act, but people have tried to make it a cybercrime. Some people have tried to just make it some type of harassment that the court should respond to. And the third way, which is when a matter is already before the court, the lawyers tack it on. So you're there for the custody, and the lawyer, JFJ lawyers do this. They've actually developed a method of doing this, trying to get anything else before the court to tack it on. So then they say, oh, judge, and by the way, the other party is harassing someone, so can you make an order telling him not to disclose status? So it's something that the judge exercises their ability to bind parties using, but it is not relying on a statutory provision, and therefore lawyers have to get all creative to find a way to prevent something. Again, precise and clear legal channels would help make that clearer.
Okay, any other questions? Let me just ask you though, because you had in looking at the research, the data points in terms of what persons who are affected have been asking for in terms of redress, sensitization, as well as legal assistance, counseling, and so on. And you said NGOs are not currently equipped to give the extent of the assistance that's needed. Where do you think, though, is the biggest gap in terms of that lack of capacity?
Okay. I think the biggest gap, so, and I have to take a pause, it's NGO specific. So groups that offer legal support, like JFJ, are not equipped to provide psychosocial support. Groups
Right.
that provide therapeutic support, principally more like the community organizations, JCW plus, JN plus, are less equipped to provide the legal support. So I see the gap as where there is a branch out into something else, they're not able right now to fulfill the demand with expertise. However, the complainants come with the need. And so I would say overall, we are less able right now to provide legal support on the scale that is needed in an aggregate sense. And I would say we are less able to meet the psychosocial demand compared to the scale of the demand, because many people need long-term counseling. They're homeless and they're coming in and that whole clinical practice that Jamaica just suffers from, and the NGO space is suffering from it in an acute way, because this is the only place that persons turn. So that's how I would answer that question.
Okay, so it sounds then as if the, what should I say, the assistance is there, but it would just have to be significantly ramped up in each area.
Significantly ramped up, or areas of specialization clearly carved out, and a strong interagency collaboration done, which really and truly is still in its nascency right now. We could probably serve that demand if everybody sat down and said, all right, here's how we're going to organize services, had like a comprehensive case management system, but we don't have that. And so with the fragmentation allows for scale to be achieved, and that's where the gaps exist that people start dropping through.
Some people want access to formal justice, others you said don't. Is it important, though, to push, encourage perhaps is a better word, encourage people to seek redress through the formal system as a way of laying down the law? I use those words advisedly, but as a way of establishing legal precedent, as a way of carving out a very clear legal framework of what is acceptable and what is not.
So in my opinion, I certainly do think so. That's why I work where I work. And as a practitioner, how I can say it is this way. I've come a long way in this. I've used to believe that if we're not making change with this case, then we just have to dedicate our efforts right here. But, you know, I think if practitioners can carve out their service modality that is honest and reflective of what they think their role is, their mission, their purpose is to serve people, then I would love to have a diversity of options available to persons, with the understanding that certain NGOs will have certain perspectives. I think it should be clear that maybe my organization believes strongly that we need to get this formal, and I need Jamaica Aid Support for Life to counsel this person so that they can get confident enough to go formal. So we have a support group modality, not for this issue, for people who families are killed by police, right? They just want to disengage, they get scared. We have sometimes to spend like a year to 2 years in support group work to get them ready to go to court. And so I think there's ways of encouraging persons that are based on building the resilience, as opposed to saying, well, you just owe it to your community members to just be the sacrificial lamb, which is really what it boils down to. And so I think having a direct discussion, though, a practitioner's discussion about that, is how we would be able to come up with those solutions.
Okay, unless there are any further questions. Any questions from the audience? In that case, we're going to wrap up this part of the program, and we're going to transition into our first panel discussion. I think I may have a question coming in, but just to let you know, as I said, we're going to have two panel discussions. One is from members of the community, where we are going to hear their lived experiences as a way of laying the groundwork for the policy and legislative discussion that we want to have. But we're going to transition into the panel discussion with a performance by Ashe.
Ooh, thank you.
Thank you, Roshi.
Hello, hi.
From the beginning of time, the cry of justice has always been, am I not a friend or a brother?
Am I not a sister or a mother?
What's good for the goose?
It's good for the gander.
One thing I know for sure, you can't sit on your ivory tower and decide who has rights and who does not. So unless everybody has rights, everybody is wrong.
We are one big family. No man will have to beg to eat. We all have dignity. No man will have to live on the street. Tell you you're a part of me. There's no need for disbelief. So here's my hand
To let you know
that what we dream,
we all can hold.
apart we are weak,
Together we're strong.
Oh,
People,
we're all writing this. We're all living this together forever. There's no reason, yeah, we can live and be one. Build the world that we want together for as long as you stay here by me. We'll live on. Hey,
people crying for justice. Everybody wants to know how this battle's gonna go.
we want peace in our community. We want justice and equality. Everybody singing justice for all. We want Jamaica to answer the call. Right now,
Right now, stand up. We're taking a stand for the life of my fellow man.
stand tall. Everybody put up on one, tall and strong.
Stand proud.
Be the change, take responsibility now.
Taking a stand, we're moving hand in hand.
So we want peace, peace of our love and what we want. When we look on, there is no justice for
Me
all.
wonder, me ponder, we don't come together to know that tomorrow things won't get better.
Everybody rise. A time for show love, human rights and justice for all.
We rise.
Don't let the politics stigmatize your heads up, stand up, reach to the sky.
Everybody singing justice for all.
We want Jamaica to answer the call.
Right now,
Now,
right now. Step in the shoes of your brother. How you wanna feel? And then kill was your father. Where you wanna do?
Step in the shoes of your sister,
Where you wanna feel?
Them post our status on Twitter.
Where you wanna do?
Step in the shoes of the youth them on the corner. Cause when them at risk, yo, that is a problem, no. We need to do all we can to understand. Cause we're all equal, yo, and we're all family now.
Everybody singing justice for all. We want Jamaica to answer the call. Right now, right now. Stand up. We're taking a stand for the life of my fellow man. Stand tall.
Everybody put up on one, tall and strong.
Stand proud.
Be the change, take responsibility now.
Taking a stand, we moving hand in hand. Yeah. Everybody singing justice for all. We want Jamaica to answer the call. Jamaicans
Now,
right now, stand up.
Every time I hear Ashe or see Ashe perform, I say, boy, the next time I come back, I want to be a dancer or a singer. But then I say Shelly Ann, and I say, boy, the next time I come. Yeah, so maybe I should just be satisfied with talking, which is what I do. We're going to move now into our first panel discussion. So we're going to invite our representatives to come to the stage. Belinda, Tashima, Lorna, Terry K, Gavin, and Kavor. Now, our second panel discussion is going to be dealing with the policy and legislative gaps and how to fix them within the context of our theme, strengthening access to justice. But before we can start to talk about institutional and systemic problems and difficulties, and before we can start to talk to the policymakers, we have to understand the human impact of the deficiencies in the system. We want to hear from people whose recommendations come from their lived experiences and their own personal interactions with the system. So I am going to ask our panelists one initial opening question, and then right after that, again, feel free to jump in with your own questions. As before, we have a roving microphone. We'll go to about 12:45 with this panel, and then we'll transition to our second panel. All right, thank you all so very much for being here. Really do appreciate it. All right, Belinda, let me ask you to start us off. Belinda is a member of the sex work community. Share with us a little bit, Belinda, how it was that you came to interact with what we call the system in trying to seek justice.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hello. Okay, please repeat your question.
I'm just asking you to share a little bit of your story in terms of how it was that you came to try to seek justice in interacting with the system, whether for you the system was police or the courts or whichever of the government institutions. How did you come into contact with it?
Okay, as a sex worker on the streets, we have our differences, or clients might take back money and stuff. When you go to the station, we have to go to the police station to report this. So sometimes we are turned back, or we're not allowed in the station.
All right, I'll tell you what, let me go down the line first and then we'll come back a little bit. Is there any one particular event though, Belinda, that sticks in your mind? Any one particular incident in which you really felt that, boy, this is not right. We're not supposed to be treated like this.
Okay, there was an issue where this girl was in a fight with a client, and she got caught. And we took her to the station. But because we were dressed as sex workers, you know, the impy-skimpy clothing, when the police officers saw us, they turned us back. Don't come into the station, you can't come in here like that, you're not wearing any clothes. But we could go home to get dressed to come back to report that she was beaten.
Okay, and that was a clear case of somebody who had been assaulted in violation of the law, and you were told you can't come and report it because of how you dress.
Yes, ma'am.
Got you. All right, Gavin, share with us for me, same kind of issue in terms of how you came to interact with the system and what your experience was.
All right. For me, basically, I've had several interactions with the police, and then there were times when I remember one of my first experiences. It wasn't necessarily an interaction. I was raped, and this was as an adult, but it was by somebody who I was involved with previously, and I had ended the relationship, but the person kept stalking me. I figured, you know, you could avoid them. It turned out one day, nobody was around, and the person used a knife and held it to my throat, and I was raped. And in that moment, when everything was finished, I thought to myself, what do I do? Am I comfortable enough? My family had an idea about, my sexuality. We would talk about it sometimes, but because of, you know, the preconceived notions and everything, it wasn't something that we discussed at the dinner table. And I thought to myself, do I I wanted to have this person punished, but because of how I perceived I would be treated in a station, I just went home and acted as if everything was normal. And I never even began to speak about this until later on in life.
So you never even tried then? You
No.
just thought about it and said, I can't deal with that.
I was so scared based on previous interactions. After that, I used to work for Ambassador King. I guess many of you would know of his notoriety. I was at the house the night when he was killed. And I remember when the police came, I mean, you can imagine all that was being said at the time and all of that. And I had to turn, at the time, Mark Shields had just come to Jamaica, and he came in, and that was when I turned to him and I said to him, I can't believe that under your watch, these men are behaving like this, and they're in uniform. And at that time, he was the only one. He cleared the route. He stopped all of them from working, and he said that at no point they were to say anything discriminatory. They were to come there and do their job and do it in a professional manner. And that was when all of the comments and everything ended, and you saw something being done. But at that point, after that, based on several things with the case, at the time, my memory was a bit, because of what had happened, I was traumatized. I didn't even know. It was later that I remembered some of the actual details, which I didn't even trust them enough to call them. I called Ambassador King's sister at the time, gave her the information, and had her relate it to them, which eventually led somebody else who was at the house saw somebody who they believed was the person who killed him. And I remember we had all given statements, and it was a holiday in April, and I called the inspector who was in charge, and I told him that this guy saw somebody who he believed was the person, and they came. He was in a class at the time, so he called the station, and they sent to pick up the guy who the other person thought was the guy.
All right,
Anyway.
let me interrupt you there for a moment, because I'm listening to you, and it's obvious that you've had some very significant and very intense experiences. Would it be correct to say your overall feeling then is one of distrust, that you will get professional, dispassionate assistance if you're trying to seek justice?
Yes and no, because
Okay.
I like to be fair.
Give me the yes very quickly and then the no very quickly. Why yes?
Yes, because of the situation I was relating to you.
Yes.
When we went in for the lineup, and I recognized that this was not the person, and I said to him, this was not the person who was there. His comment to me, and I said, read the statement that I gave you originally, and his answer to me was I was not to be concerned with things that could be changed.
Okay, and then the no is why? You
The
said
no was an experience that a friend of mine had where he was attacked by a lover, and then we actually went to I encouraged him to go to the station. And when we went to the station, the way how he was treated, I was actually surprised. It was a young policeman. He sat, he took the report, and he did all that he was supposed to do.
All right.
And I think there were two other occasions when I went to the station when things happened, and they didn't even bother to take the report. They just listened to the story, and then you know how they should take the report and give you the slip?
Yeah. Sometimes you get it, sometimes you don't. Some mixed
I
experiences.
got no sleep.
All right, hold that thought for me. And let me just say to members of the audience that, as you can hear, the panelists are sharing with us very deeply personal and very sensitive information. We're asking that no photographs be taken. We're asking that no photographs be published of the panelists, so that this is essentially a safe space for them to share that information. And let me ask Tashima now. You're a survivor of domestic violence, Tashima. Tell us a little bit about your attempts to seek justice.
Good afternoon, everyone. Well, my experience, I have quite a lot, but I'll refer to one specific one. I was being abused by my partner, and I called the police, and it was a night. And when I called the police, who answered the phone, I relate the situation to her. She said I should come to the station. I said, Miss, I have 2 kids and it is night. Could you please send a vehicle because I fear my life is being threatened because the man said, "I'll kill me." She insists I must come to the station in the night, and I said, Miss, no, we are there to serve and protect. Where is it that you are serving me or protecting me? And I have 2 kids and I cannot find my way in the night to the station. And she was definitely insisting then I wait and come in the morning. And that was what I had to do, wait and go in the morning.
There's so many issues that arise just in that brief story. But Lorna, let me come to you first. Hold the mic up to your mouth for me, Lorna.
I'm sorry. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lorna. My issue is...
Point the mic towards your mouth.
I'm doing...
Yeah, man. You're good. You're good.
You still not hearing me? Okay. Yeah. My issue is I have so many experience, but I'm choosing this one. I felt betrayed in a sense when you go to the station and you make a report. And I think I, as a citizen, have the right to go and make a report. But when you go to the station, I'm not saying all of the officers, but some of them take it for a joke. Because first thing, they must say, oh, you know, the person you're talking about is them doing whatever.
Can you tell us what kind of matter you went to report?
I went to report being threatened by my partner that I live with. He threatened to kill me, could take off my neck, cut off my neck and all these things. But to me, they take it as a joke. Because they laugh and were saying that if me can't see him, or me know say him and all these things. And I'm saying that you go to make a serious report like a threat, and you're making all these jovial thing about it, and I take it very seriously.
And that is in relation to the fact that, in fact, you're blind.
Right.
So they're asking if you can see him, how you know it's him.
Yeah, they ask me how I know him is him. I'm sure who talk to me. And these things, it's upsetting. Because to my knowledge, we are at the age now where we know about blindness. I know a blind person move around in the community. I don't have to tell you all these things because you know that. So why are you as an officer asking me if I can't see, if I sure say a person, or I sure say a person, or I know say him and all these things? And it affects me very much. I know I've other persons been there too, but I'm talking personally about my own, and it still affects me because I have an issue where I went, but and when you report the matter...
Hold down the mic to your mouth.
When you report the matter, they don't come, or when they come, for instance, the gentleman was supposed to be served a summons from the court. I took him to court to get him out of my place because I can't see him now come out without bloodshed. So I took him to court. The judge ordered that him supposed to be removed from the premises and come to court. He came to court. The police are serving this summons, but they didn't actually make him removed from the premises.
Okay.
So when we went to court and the judge heard that he was still there, the judge said, why is he there? And an order is issued that he's supposed to be out of the premises. And then when they did come back after the court to remove him, then we serve him a summons again to go to court. And then the judge, when I call the station, I say, officer, I don't understand. I'm supposed to move him things them. The policeman say, hold on. Woman, use some discretion. And I'm saying, what? Use a little discretion. Thinking, how much was the man have nowhere to go? That have nothing to do with me. No, I am not laughing. This is not a joke. You threaten me, say you cut off my head. You shove knife in me and turn it around and all this. You want to poison me. And me tell you all these things, you still make the man come back. I think this is a joke.
All right, just before I move on, I just want to get a little bit of context in terms of timing, because we hear about the sensitivity training that is given to, for instance, members of the police force. So, Lorna, this was about when this happened?
Last year.
And for you, Tashimo, about when?
My incident happened about 2 to 3 years ago.
Okay. All right, thanks so much for that. Let me ask Terry Kay now to share with us.
Good afternoon, everyone. So my experience with some police officers in Half-a-Tree, I was attacked in Half-a-Tree by several men, bus drivers, on my way going home. And I went to the police station.
I beg your pardon, and this is because they knew you were trans?
Yes. So I went to the police station to make a report. So when I went to the police station to make a report, then an officer turned to me and said to me, what am I doing here? I told him that I came to make a report in regards to an incident that happened. So he said to me that, why did they attack me? I said I was just walking and then I was attacked. An other police officer came from around the back and then he was like asking me to leave. When he asked me to leave, I turned to him and said, why am I making a report? He said, I must get out of the station because they don't tolerate these things. So I then turned to him and said, am I not a Jamaican? Can I make is it not right for me to make a report? And then he started to get aggressive and started pushing me, almost pepper spray. But I had was to leave because I couldn't have handled the pepper spray. So I went
Was there any intervention or comment, anything from anybody else in the station, any of the other police?
No, because when I get there, most of the officers went around the back.
You mean as in trying to avoid you?
Yes.
I see.
So I went.
Hold the mic to your mouth.
I had a police friend, cousin in the force, where I called her and I explained the situation to her, and then she called the station, and then they said to her that I came into the station with anger and was being disrespectful, which I wasn't. So that was my experience. That was in 2018.
And Kavor, talk to us a little bit. Persons living with HIV and the kind of situations you face in trying to access justice.
Sitting here in my capacity today, I learn now how discrimination affects access to justice, access to health, and how that affects lack of treatment and care, and how lack of treatment and care access lack of adherence, and how lack of adherence result in transmission. That was my experience. I was diagnosed in 2016. Prior to being diagnosed, I was invited at a workshop, unaware of HIV, what it is meticulously, how it is transmitted, how it is acquired. When I got there, I learned of my diagnosis. The security guard was very stereotypical, you know, gender non-binary presenting. I was stereotyped. And it is important how Roger mentioned how securities are not necessarily healthcare workers. tend to perpetuate discrimination in these treatment sites. So it was a security guard, then learning of my diagnosis, and then a week learning of my diagnosis in confidence. I learned of it in the community, in the LGBT community, and also how that affects involuntary and involuntary disclosure. Because of that, I didn't went back there. So learning my diagnosis, I didn't start for treatment and care because of my experience, and this was for 2 years. During these 2 years, I was having unprotected sex. I was experiencing a lot of trauma, synonymous to my sexuality, being gay and being Christian, being outed for my sexuality, again being outed for my health status. So the access to justice there was a government facility, and I felt betrayed and somehow dishonored to learn that something so delicate was made known to persons whom I even don't know. You know, people would message me on social media and say, "Cuthbert, I heard that you're HIV positive." I'm like, "What? I never know too." So it's the issue of confidentiality with healthcare workers. It not only affects the individual, it affects the transmission. And so that was my experience.
Okay, I am opening up to questions at this time, but again, in line with our theme, access to justice, I also want to ask the panelists. So feel free to jump in at any point, but in the meantime, I'll ask the panelists to start by telling us, based on these personal experiences that they've shared, what is it they would most like to see, or what do they think would be most effective in terms of changing the way things now are to enable members of your community to be able to better access justice. So Gavin, I'll start with you. What most, if you were to pick, maybe what 2 things do you think are most important that need to happen?
I think basically from the Police Training Institute, we should start, I think, right across the border. Police, nurses, even medical doctors, every facet of, or every, what should I say, every profession then should be sensitized as to how to deal with persons with different gender identities and sexual orientations from the training institute. Don't wait until these people get into jobs and they come with all their issues, Christianity, socialization, this, that. Treat from, start working from that point to educate people on the fact that in doing their work, regardless of their personal feelings, they should be impartial in how they deal with persons.
So would you say that if somebody were to say to you, that's already happening, man, all of them already get training, would you say that it doesn't show? In other words, it's not working? If it is that they're already doing some training, would you say then that that needs to be improved or strengthened?
It needs to be improved because it's not effective, and it's not across the board. And in addition to that, I think there should be sanctions for persons who do not follow guidelines. There should be direct sanctions, or...
When you say follow guidelines, you mean who disclose that kind of personal information?
Not only disclosure, but once persons do not treat persons fairly, regardless of everything, we're all citizens of Jamaica. So we are entitled to whatever privileges are there under the law for everyone.
So some kind then of effective complaints mechanism to report unprofessional behavior.
Exactly.
Gotcha.
And once there are reports and it is investigated and found credible, I'm not saying persons should really lose their work.
But there should be some action.
There should be sanctioned, sent for resensitization, retraining, or whatever, and it should be in law so that it is followed.
Okay, all right, that's excellent. Belinda, for you, what perhaps one or two most important recommendations would you make to strengthen access to justice for your community?
Okay, first I must say, police officers or the justice system should know that sex work is work, right? So we're asking to decriminalize sex work. When we have laws like, if I am friend with somebody and that person knows that I'm a sex worker, that person can be prosecuted because he or she is seen in a company of a sex worker. That is saying that a sex worker shouldn't have friends. And if my children knows that I'm selling sex and they take the money that I earn for school or for food, they too can be taken away from me, or if they're underage, or they can be prosecuted. So what are sex workers to do? I mean, decriminalize, and then we can go forward from there. So we can have our children who are not afraid to accept money or say, all right, mommy is a sex worker, and this is what she does for me to go to school or for me to eat, and that's my mommy's friend, and she knows that mommy is a sex worker and not ashamed.
All right, so decriminalization as a first step, because you're saying as it is, because of the criminal element, your sex workers are punished by the system.
Yes.
In other ways, such as custody issues, children, and so on. Thank you so much.
All right, so for me, is that the first thing when you're going to sign a legal document, the only thing you're going to see is male and female. At no point in time on this you see others or trans persons. So I would want us as transgender to be recognized so that other persons in the wider society can recognize that there are transgenders in Jamaica.
So that's policy, and you would also want to see, if possible, any legislative amendment to recognize that?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much, Terry K. Lorna?
Yes, sir.
What's the most important recommendation you would make to ensure better access to justice for persons with disabilities?
I'm not going to say for all, but I think some of the officers them take this thing for a joke. When you have a disability and you're coming to make a report, just by one comment one of them made to me when I insist to make the report, it was like, you know, sir, you have the man problem. You have the man problem, make him a behave, so. And at the same time, I didn't really look at it. It's after I leave the station. And I think they need to train these police officers about dealing with persons with a disability. Because we are intelligent persons.
Do you think the treatment is as if that they don't see you as a person? The kind of jokes and comments that are made, they don't see you as a Jamaican who has walked in looking for help?
Yes, because coming out of the station, I feel like I was just stripped of all my clothes and everything. And it hurts. Because when you have issues like those, you go to the station. And if they are not tending to your issues there, where else do you go? They are supposed to protect us, right? And you are going to make sly remarks and all these things. It makes me feel as if I am the person making the problem. I shouldn't be there.
All right, so your major recommendation then is for increased sensitivity training.
Exactly.
How to relate to persons with disabilities, whether the person is blind, in a wheelchair, or any other type of disability.
Yes.
All right, Tashima, what about you?
So my recommendation that I would say for the police officers, they are trained, and they are sensitized about how to deal with persons who are facing domestic violence. But a lot of these officers, they just don't care, right? And some of them are facing their own traumas. They have their own demons in the same making. So I think that they need to go back to the drawing board. They need to do some form of counseling, some form of debriefing with these police officers. Because if we don't find the root cause, there will be no changes, right? And they need to incorporate the NGOs within the law system, because these NGOs know how to deal with persons who are facing any form of violence, right? They know how to talk to us and how to get down to our level, right? And they understand us. So I think they could partner with NGOs, and NGOs could give them a helping hand on how to go about dealing with persons who are facing violence.
All right, so you're saying they're trained, but because they don't care, there needs to be a little bit more work done on dealing with the officers themselves, and you want a more formal role for the NGOs because they're the ones who interact most with you. Kavor, what about you?
For me, I think the ultimate change will happen through legislative reform, through political and constitutional powers. Currently, the Charter of Fundamental Rights and Freedom does not protect against discrimination on several bases. And this is not an attempt to bash or to call out any government or any historical amendment that either side has made or legislation that either side has enacted. It doesn't discriminate against sex, biological sex, language, disability status, health status, marital status. When that happens, a comprehensive anti-discriminatory law will be amended, will be in legislation, and what that will do is criminalize discrimination. For me, I think a legitimacy for discrimination to be criminalized is that currently the country is having a brain drain. Bright people are leaving the country, and I'm next on the list. J-Flag, JFJ, Caribbean Policy, Caribbean Institute for, what's the name of the organization, Glenroy? CAFRI. Caribbean Policy Research Institute has quantified discrimination. It affects the economic and corporate development of the country. It is antithetical to the National Development Plan of Jamaica. Once discrimination is decriminalized, Jamaica will be better, simply put.
So for you, the main thrust you want to see then is legislative amendment and constitutional amendment if necessary.
Indeed.
All right, thank you all so very much. Any questions from the panel before I thank our panelists for their very frank and candid and I would say wise suggestions that they've made here this afternoon? Can we get a mic?
First of all, thank you so much for your bravery, but also your willingness to stand up and to speak on how members of the populations can access justice. But I am mindful of the last presentation by Roger, and also mindful of the question that the moderator put to the journalist not to take pictures. So, sacrificial lamb, I know that no one wants to be that sacrificial lamb, to be put out there to be harmed and to be run out of your community. but do any of you have any recommendations on how do you harness your power? Because there are 6 of you on the stage, but there are no cameras. I'm not sure how your stories will be managed for us. Because when I heard some of your stories, look, I've been in this thing a long time. I still want to cry. And I am mindful, I am a little fearful that we may not be able to get the legislation, the shift in policy, the change in attitudes, the heartstring moving a little, if we don't hear your 6 stories. So I want to ask either one of you, how do you think the NGOs or civil society or even government agencies that engage you, how do we harness your stories to get your stories to persons without risking your health or harming your families?
Yeah, thank you so much. And that's such an excellent point, because the Charter of Rights was 20 years before we managed to get it passed. And even then, as our panelists have alluded to, there were so many things that had been advocated for that were left out. So does anybody want to? Yes. So the question is, how do we harness the power of the stories that we've heard here to try to push for change and increase access to justice? I should just take a moment to acknowledge the fact that the Minister of State, Alando Terrelonge, has arrived, and we'll be hearing from him in just a little while.
I think personally, we're going to have to go back to the old days when to open up the discussion or to have the discussion out there. Programs like this probably opened up to the wider media, where faces are distorted and voices are changed, and then the discussion is had. Because in reality, I would never tell anybody to go out there and offer and put themselves up, because alluding to the same situation with Ambassador King, when I testified there to have the guy convicted, I did it based on the premise that I think this guy should have been punished for killing somebody. And at the end of the day, I have received death threats from this guy in prison. I contacted the prosecutor, who at the time when they wanted to make their case was calling my phone constantly. She had left the job, and when I called her in her private practice, she put me onto somebody else, who put me onto somebody else, who put me onto some inspector who I've never spoken to. I visited the office of the public defender, and I've received nothing. This guy comes out in the next 2 years, and just as Cowboy said, I'm looking to leave in the next 2 years because I'm not staying here. And if I did not testify, they would not have had a case. And I remember the morning when they were taking up his body, and I asked to go up there to look, and I said to myself in my head, is this how you're going to die? That was the first question. And the second thought I had was, if you die, who is going to care to try and solve this case? And interestingly enough, don't believe it was through their ardent investigation that the perpetrator was brought to justice. Yes, they did go and look for him, but when they didn't find him, it ended. He was actually arrested in another parish for a totally different reason, and a policewoman who was there saw him and recognized who he was and checked the books to see what he was there for. He was listed under a different name, and then it clicked in her head. Aren't you so?
This is somebody who was wanted.
Who they wanted for the murder.
Yes.
And that's how he was brought to justice.
Yes, and I get from your story that you're saying you really put yourself at great risk. If you put yourself out there, and really the way we continue to share these stories is by anonymizing them, because the system does not protect those who choose to step forward.
Exactly.
And I think that's something we do have to sit with a little bit and think about.
In addition, as a gay man, I don't know, I guess some of us are, there's a great man once said, justice will never be served or not be served until those who are unaffected are as outraged as those who are. I find that a lot of persons, because it doesn't concern them, they don't think and they don't care and they don't realize how hard it is for somebody who is gay or identifies as gay to live in this country, because I live with the reality that if I'm killed for whatever reason, even if it has nothing to do with me being gay, after these policemen find out my sexuality, is my death going to be investigated as it should, and are the perpetrators going to be brought to justice, or am I just going to become another statistic? And what sort of ways is that for you to live in a country?
Yeah, I think on that very powerful note, I'm going to wrap up this panel, because I think that's a lot for us to think about and to internalize as we talk about increasing access to justice and strengthening access to justice. It's important to understand the gaps that are there, as I said earlier on, identified not just by the academics and the advocates and the NGO reps, but by the people who actually have to put their lives on the line, their dignity on the line, their self-respect when they attempt to use those channels that now exist. Can I thank you all so very much? Yes, I think a round of applause is very much deserved there. Belinda, Tashima, Lorna, Terike, Gavin, and Kavor have been sharing with us. Thank you all so very much. And in the next few minutes, we're moving into our second panel discussion. I think our guests here have laid the perfect foundation for us now to build on as we talk about policy and institutional differences. So we're just going to break just for a couple of minutes, just so that we can make that transition with the panel. So don't go anywhere. We are continuing. We're not even really breaking. Hey, don't, let me not photobomb you.
That's all right. From there.
Another performance by Ashe before we go into the second panel discussion. So they'll be making their way forward while we go on with the photo ops. So we'll be enjoying another performance by Ashe, and then we'll be going into the second panel discussion. And just to acknowledge as well the arrival of State Minister and Minister of Health, Juliet Cuthbert Flynn. She'll also be on the second panel. So do enjoy this second performance.
Oh, yes. Ooh, we all are one. We are the same person. I'll be you, you be me. We all are one. Same universal world. I'll be you, you be me. We all are one. We all are one. We are the same person. I'll be you, you be me. You be me. We all are one. Same universal world. I'll be you, you be me. Let me tell you, no matter where we are born, we are human beings with the same chemistry, with emotions and feelings all corresponding in love. We're compatible. Can't get around it no matter how hard you try. Better believe it. And if you should find out that you are no different than I, reply. We all are one. We are the same person. I'll be you, you be me. We all are one. Same universal world. I'll be you, you be me. We all are one. We are the same person. I'll be you, you be me. We all are one. Same universal world. I'll be you, you be me.
The only difference I can see is in our conscience. The shade of the skin doesn't matter.
We laugh, we chatter, oh we smile, and we all live for the feelings that make all those faces
Always renewed.
so renewed. Would you believe that I have all the same feelings too? The same as you. We all are one. We are the same person. I'll be you, you be me. We all are one. Same universal world. I'll be you, you be me. Come on, we all are one. We are the same person. I'll be you, you be me. We all are one. Same universal world. I'll be you be me. Say, we all are one. We are the same person. I'll be you, you be me. Sing it. We all are one. We are the same person. I'll be you, you be me. Say, we all are one. We are the same person. I'll be you, you be me. We all, come on. We all are one. Ashe.
Thank you so very much, Ashe. So we're about to move into our second panel discussion. As I mentioned, our first, I think, very nicely set the stage and gave us a human face of what it means to be in Jamaica in a vulnerable community seeking access to justice. So the panelists we have in this segment, we are going to be building on that discussion, talking about what now exists and how we strengthen the policy and the legislative and the institutional mechanisms that are in place. Let me welcome Juliet Cuthbert Flynn, State Minister in the Ministry of Health and Wellness, and ask her to come forward. Also with us, Alando Terrelonge, State Minister in the Ministry of Culture, Gender, Entertainment and Sports. The Public Defender, Arlene Harrison Henry, Glenroy Murray, Director of Strategy and Impact at Equality for All Foundation, and Paul Hines of the Dispute Resolution Foundation, Lead Content Deliverer and Consultant. So again, just to remind you that we do want an interactive session, so as soon as they've made their initial statements, I invite you to feel free to jump in with your questions. All right, let me ask, I'm gonna ask Mr. Terrelonge to start off. Now, if you follow Mr. Terrelonge on social media, you know he's a passionate champion of youth, of the vulnerable population. He's also very openly shared his own experience in Jamaica with stigma and discrimination as it relates to hair and hairstyle and how that impacts in the labor market. So he is an ideal person now to talk to us about some of these issues. So my question for you, Mr. Terrelonge, is tell us where you see, from your perspective, where you see the gaps and what you think we can be doing better.
Mic check, audible?
Mic check is good.
All right, so again, thank you so much, Lady Jackson Miller, and to all my esteemed panelists, good afternoon to you all, and to those persons who shared earlier, you know, thank you for your openness, and we thank you for your honesty as well. For my part, I genuinely believe that we need to confront negative stereotypes in our country. And to do that, it requires a re-socialization of sorts. And to do that, we need to educate our youth from the beginning about the need to respect themselves and also the need to respect others. Because when one thinks about discrimination, the hallmark of discrimination is really, it's an intolerance or it's a lack of respect for others. And certainly that would need a cultural shift where we learn to respect others as well. From a ministry perspective, we've been looking a lot at gender-based violence. And we see how that plays out, you know, and I've always maintained that our young kings must be, again, going back to the re-socialization and the education, they must first learn to respect themselves and what it means to be a man, and also to respect women and what it means to be a woman, and understand that you do not condone or permit or be party to gender-based violence or discrimination along any level at all. And of course, there are other matters as well and other factors within our society, which again, it goes right back to the point of just unlearning negative stereotypes. So I think that's a good place to start.
Let me push you on that a little bit, though, because the point you make, of course, very well taken in terms of the need for re-socialization. But from an institutional point of view, as you said, you heard the panelists speaking earlier of their difficulties with accessing the system, the very institutions that are supposed to be in place to support and to assist them. So when you look at it from that vantage point, what more do you think we need to do as far as the state is concerned?
Okay, so I think greater training is important. Greater training, and because I believe that with greater training, and this is where get the partnership between civil society organizations and government. So you speak about, let's look at domestic violence, for example, or abuse of children. I recall one at the time when I spoke to her, she was about 22 years old, and she indicated that at 12 years old, she went to the police station, didn't know what to do. She received can I say backsliding? She received a thorough thrashing from her mother. I mean, mother beat her, just put it in the look. Her mother beat her bad. And at 12 years old, she went to the police station to say, look what my mother has done to me. She's taken the electric cord and she beat her, she had cuts on her bruise. And she said that the officer she spoke to said, little Pitney, you must have manners, go and make your yard. And at 22, she still has these scars because that's what she remembers of her experience of child abuse. And I mean, and I spoke a lot on this issue when I was state minister in the Ministry of Education and Youth about the need to have positive discipline. So yes, you can discipline your children, Dion, but discipline them with love. And when as a government, we speak about, you know, I mean, removing corporal punishment from institutions and from society, from our homes, but then we get a pushback. We get a pushback from the society that says, I feel me pinning them so I can't beat them and I can't kill them if we want. So this not, in other words, we have normalized violence at so many levels, even within the home, that it filters into the society. So you have the domestic abuse where persons figure, boy, a man and woman argument, or I feel pinning them, and it permeates society, and then you get it across all levels, whether it's sex workers or wherever else, because there's just this, okay, well, that's how the system set up.
Yeah, so it's how we break that. Let me come to Mrs. Cuthbert Flynn now. I know you're still pretty new in the Ministry of Health, less than 3 months, I think, as Minister of State. But again, if you follow the State Minister on social media, you'll see that she has thrown herself into this portfolio with great energy and intensity and interest. And I'd love your perspective on what you have seen in the months you've been there and how effectively you think we are indeed allowing access to justice for these vulnerable communities, especially those in your sector, which is, for instance, those with HIV and so on.
Thank you so much, Dion. It's really a pleasure to be in a part of this forum because I think it's so important. I wasn't here to hear what was taking place, but just being out there, I know that discrimination is definitely one of the things that we must overcome in this country for persons to access care and to feel that in order, again, we go back to the point, in order to become virally suppressed, persons have to first get the care, get on their medication, stay on their medication. And one of the reasons why I think persons do not stay on their medication or come to care is because they feel some sort of discrimination or fear. And as Minister Terrelonge said, you know, it goes back to the community and re-socializing people, changing the attitude of HIV and AIDS. And, you know, the ministry can only do so much. We do have a section where you can lodge complaints if it is that you feel a sense of, you know, like as if you've been discriminated against. However, I think much education is needed in the space, in the Jamaican space. And I think that is one of the ways I think we can tackle this, is to educate people about HIV. Just for an example, last week when they had my face on one of the AIDS program, somebody asked on social media, so why fear face have to be with the AIDS thing? And so again, we still have that thinking in Jamaica about HIV and AIDS, and I think that is one of the reasons why persons are not accessing care. So the ministry, we can only do so much, and we have done our part. You have quite a number of partners, UNAIDS, the EU, the CDC, granting funds, the local partners here in Jamaica, JASL. And so the system is in place for persons to access care. It's just now we need to think about how do we get persons to feel comfortable enough to want to access the care.
Again, just pushing back at you a little bit, State Minister, because one of the themes we heard from the participants who shared earlier, in fact, was their outrage and their shock when their private information was made known to public, when they in fact tried to do the very thing you're speaking about and you know, sought care. And that among the primary abusers of that confidence are people who are in the healthcare system, security guards who are at the doors of the clinics, and even some of the healthcare workers. So I hear you when you're saying the ministry has done its part, but I'm going to at least suggest for your consideration that that can't be said until this very critical issue of breach of confidence by the professionals who work for government in the system is dealt with. But as I said, just something to think along as we think about as we continue to discuss. Glenroy Murray, let me bring you in here, the gaps you're seeing.
So for me, I sit at the position of somebody who contributed to the report. And so
I take the view that there are gaps at different entry points. At the level of the state, we need protective legislation. That very much is clear. We're just coming off of the Universal Periodic Review, and it was once again recommended that there be comprehensive anti-discrimination legislation by several states. And so I'm glad to see the particular state actors that I'm seeing on this particular panel, because we've seen demonstrations of political will from both you, State Minister Cuthbert, Flynn, and you, State Minister Terrelonge. And that's what we need more of, persons who are willing to push against the grain and say, we need this kind of action, whether it is around abortion or how bullying happens in schools. We need to see more of that so that when we train persons and they go back into the institutions, the systems that are set up work in a particular way where persons feel like there are sanctions for their actions, because that's the missing bit. We as civil society, we end up in this cycle of train, complain, and repeat, because the bit of enforcing, which we can't do from where we sit, doesn't always happen because people don't feel like anything can happen to them. But in terms of what we as civil society can do, I think there's a lot to be done about making communities feel like they belong and that they matter. A part of the report that shocked me while I was doing it was the high levels of self-stigma among persons living with HIV. And it means then we need to start getting people HIV to not feel ashamed of who they are, to feel like they can step forward and talk about their issues. There has to be a greater focus on empowerment. We've taught them about their rights. The report says they know this. We've taught them that they're supposed to get redress. We need to teach them or help them to understand, because it's not so much just a putting forward, that this space belongs to them, that they're Jamaicans just as anyone else, and that they can go forward. And then the last bits I would say for right now is that we need to have greater collaboration. I love the fact, and I think one of the strengths with the healthcare response is that we've been able to go in and train people. We've been able to build relationships. We need to see that across ministries. Police have been singled out as one of the main deterrents for both communities in the report. And we know that JFJ is doing training with them. What is happening in service? How is the government engaging civil society and vice versa to ensure that the reports are coming forward, that they're going to the OPD, that they're going to Indicom and those different things? We as civil society also have a responsibility to, where we can, make sure that the government is apprised and are getting the statistics. And then the government then needs to understand that the reason why people come to us and not them is that we care to create a space where they feel comfortable. And so one of the challenges with the report was that government services didn't feel they needed to do targeted services. And I understand why. We're used to vulnerability in Jamaica, whether it is because of poverty or something else. We're used to vulnerability. Yeah, we do need to break that. But what I'm saying is, because we're used to vulnerability, we don't understand the need to do targeted services. And that is what needs to happen. People need to understand that by just having a simple change in the form that Terry K mentioned, or just having a simple sign that says we do not discriminate here, it begins the process. And that's where the political will comes in, getting the actors in the civil service and public service to understand that these little things matter.
I'm going to go to the public defender, Arlene Harrison Henry. Now, Mrs. Harrison Henry has spent her entire career defending the rights of members of the public, many of whom had nowhere else to turn. So the position of public defender really is just almost a formal title that has been given to the work that she's been doing all her life. I know there's a lot on your shoulders, Madam Public Defender, especially in the widespread absence of civil legal aid. A lot of people look to your office to fill so many gaps and to help in so many ways. In terms of this particular issue, access to justice for members of these vulnerable and marginalized communities, do you feel your office has what it needs in terms of the legislative empowerment as well as resources?
Dion, let me first of all thank Jassel for this excellent report and all the persons who worked on it. We at OPD commend this kind of work. It helps to keep the issue alive, the issues burning. But as we talk, those of us who have been involved in these discussions over the years will know that recommendations have been made for legal aid to be given. And we have said, this is now from a bar perspective and a human rights perspective, we have said, if not legal aid for all civil matters, then for administrative law and constitutional matters. The debate for the anti-discriminatory legislation has gone on for years, longer than many persons are alive in this room. And therefore, whilst I see progress being made, I can't help but sit and say we ought to have made greater strides. Now, our office does have the mandate for providing redress for constitutional violations and likely violation of constitutional rights. I cannot say that we have been, I know that many of the complaints are dealt with by several other groups, and say whether through the Ministry of Labor, whether through the Ministry of Health, whether through JFJ. And I really want to commend civil society for this tremendous work and service that they provide to these communities that are in many ways underserved and picked out for special treatment. And by special treatment, I mean for discrimination. But Dion, I don't want to take up too much time, but I just want to make a few comments. And the story of stigma and discrimination is nothing new in Jamaica. Stigma and discrimination seem virtually to be a part of our DNA. People will remember when COVID came, the response, some persons didn't want persons in the car with them, taxi drivers. There were instances where somebody coughed and they got beaten out of a bus. So we tend to have that response. But what I want to say is that violence against the community of persons living with HIV, AIDS, and those associated with them, that violence is really a microcosm of the violence in the society at large. And it is intensified in these communities because people, in fact, you don't have to be HIV, AIDS, you can just be perceived to be. And I think that what is needed, folks, is leadership at the top. If we are going to address stigma and discrimination whilst shoring up redress mechanisms is very important and cannot be overstated.
So what do you want to see when you say leadership from the top? Tell me what that should look like.
We need leadership from the highest level of our political representatives, leadership from Parliament, leadership from our churches.
But to do what?
To advocate against all forms of discrimination against any group, individual of persons in Jamaica. You see, without some sort of broad consensus, we're not going to win the fight against stigma and discrimination. And what we really need is a community where we recognize each other as Jamaicans, as one human being to the other. What does it matter? So we need a community based in social justice where human dignity and respect for all are the basis on which we treat one with the other. Those would be my comments.
Thank you so much. Paul Hines, let me come to you. One of the issues that is raised in this report and that Roger shared earlier when he was presenting the summary is that whereas some people who are seeking justice are looking for justice through the formal legal systems, others would be happy with alternative mechanisms. And of course, dispute resolution has been such a critical role, played such a critical role in helping to intersect some of the violence and some of the difficulties we've had. Is the Dispute Resolution Foundation, though, in a position to respond to the needs we've been hearing articulated here?
Thank you. Mic check. Thank you, Dion, for the question. And first, let me say thank you to Jason for an excellent report. Let me start from the song that Ashe just sung about we all are one. It begs the question, are we really? Let's think about it. If we all are one, we need to begin to piggyback on what the public defender just said, that there are ways that people would like to have respect shown to them and dignity recognized. And what the Dispute Resolution Foundation has been about is just that. How do we afford persons an opportunity to find ways of discussing issues that are deeply cultural, and find their own answers? And the foundation has been doing that. If you provide persons with trained facilitators in a private, safe space who will not be taking sides, but enabling the persons to really get into the nuances of why, when there is domestic violence and there's an occupation order, why is it not being enforced? Why is it that there's a need for it? How do the parties really want to resolve it? Foundation has been doing that work. Can it do more? Yes. Does it need more resources? Absolutely yes. Because I recognize in the report that there are lots more persons where they are aware that they could come to the foundation to have their matters addressed, or even aspects of it. That will be a lot more work. So yes, there is a space for it. And I want to reiterate that to provide persons with an opportunity to have their matters discussed, for them to discuss it in a space where it is safe, private, and they are guaranteed confidentiality, because one aspect of the report spoke about lack of confidentiality. I think all mediators who are trained by the DRF can speak to that significant and important component that you have to guarantee persons the dignity, the respect, the affirmation, and the confidentiality. So that would be my response initially.
Thank you so much. And just to remind you, anybody can jump in, just indicate, and a mic will be brought to you if you do have. We have a question in the front. Can we have a mic brought to Javion, please? Want to share one? Oh, there you go. And a question behind him after that.
Thanks, Diana, and thanks to the panelists. Congrats to Jassel on this report. And note from, for example, page 66, it talks about people's conception of justice and what justice means to the key populations, specifically pale HIV and LGBT people who were surveyed and who participated in the focus group discussion. And I think if you look at that second paragraph on the on page 66 on the right side, it shows that, to me, the problem here, though sex orientation and gender identity and HIV status has play an important role in the experiences of people, where we actually start in terms of access to justice is Jamaicans' conception and our attitudes and feeling about the justice system in general. And so I'm keen to hear from the panelists, what do they think we actually need to do? Because I don't think we'll actually treat with this, the issue that we have at hand if we're focusing primarily on sex orientation, gender identity, and HIV status.
I'm not clear on your question.
What do we need to do? How do we get to the root of the problem? Because I don't think
of which problem?
Of the access to justice problem. Because I don't think, based on, if you look, for example, respondents' notion of justice is that it's unattainable, elusive to them given their vulnerability, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
And if you look at a lot of reports, it's the same thing. Children's rights, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't think we're actually dealing with sexual orientation, gender identity issue, and PLHIV status just by itself.
So you want the panelists to comment on how we get to the root of people's feeling that they don't have access to justice?
How we improve access to justice?
Okay, there you go. Glenroy, let me start with you on that.
I feel a particular way about this because for my dissertation, I focused on access to justice and language. And in the same way, people don't feel like justice belongs to them as PLHIV and LGBT people, that's the same issue. But even though that particular paper focused on a slim notion of justice, I would suggest that we start to talk about justice in the broader way. Because people need to know that they have options. And so I think there needs to be greater investment in alternative disputes resolutions. So more resources for things like DRF, more resources for a victim support unit, more resources for other type of conciliation services. So for example, both the Office of the Public Defender and INDECOM offer forms of conciliation services. Those need to be promoted more. Those need to be staffed more because we're not a litigious people and adversarial processes don't bear out for us and the court can't do certain things. The court can't take a side. And oftentimes when you're in a position of vulnerability just based on power structure, you need some level of people understanding your particular vulnerability, and there's a limit to how the court can do that. So I think that's a big part of the challenge.
So summarize that for me in a sentence. What is it would be your answer to Javian? How do we improve access to justice?
Put more resources in the forms of justice that people want, ADR and those kinds of things, and we as civil society connect people to those forms of justice.
And I think just to add, even if you put the resources there, people must know that they can access these resources and that they do have a voice. Because as you just said, some people possibly feel that they're less than. A lot of us in Jamaica, we feel that we're not worthy. And they do not know that certain things are out there for them to actually access, that they can have a voice. And I think so some of those things, even if you put the resources there, the education then must come with that to explain to the Jamaican population that you can be heard if it is that you have issues with discrimination, etc.
That should come from where though, Minister?
Well, again, it should come from us here in the Ministry of Health to actually, get the information out there, civil society to get the information out there. And again, as Ms. Arlene said, Ms. Harrison said, from the top, I think we all must play a part in that to explain and express to the Jamaican people that they do have a voice, and if they do speak up, that they will be heard.
Mr. Terrelonge, how do we improve access to justice?
Yeah, I think the greater community intervention is also a start, because with the community intervention, then we'll be raising awareness. And when we raise awareness, we help to break down negative stereotypes. We help to re-educate our population, and that has to be a start. And one of the things I thought about, this morning, preparing for the seminar, and I thought, but where does harsher penalties take us? Quite frankly, I mean, does it really take us where we want to go? And I don't think so. I don't think so, simply because at the end of the day, in the heat of the moment, unless and until we have a proper conflict resolution training or program, or a population that understands conflict resolution, then harsher penalties it's really relevant. It's of no moment. And I recall vividly a video, Dion, and I've seen several videos, and this one, I mean, it has to be within the top 3 that hurt me. And it was where a group of men ganged up on a young lady. And why did they gang up on her? Because she made a comment about oral sex and another young man and what he did, and him performing oral sex on her. And it led to such a brutal beating. And I mean, and other young men were there. They were kind of pushing him on and saying, "Yeah, man, kill her, kill her, kill her, kill her, kill her." In that heat of the moment, harsher penalties was completely irrelevant to him, because there was nothing before. There was no training in terms of conflict resolution and the access to justice. Okay, but what? How far does it take these 2 young individuals and their friends who have a whole bunch of negative stereotypes that they need to unlearn about varying social issues. So you look at sex, church, and education, and how those three things play with precisely why we're having a discussion such as this.
Yeah, and I think the point you're making there about, coming down with the heavy hand of the law isn't the best approach in a lot of those situations. But again, as Glenroy and Roger had alluded to, the view of justice is a lot wider than that. And the avenues to justice can be, more plentiful and more significant than that. So having acknowledged that we don't want that kind of heavy-handed approach. And again, I hear you on the community aspect of things, but you're with the state and you're with a lot of the guys who are giving the problems, to use very informal language. So tell me what, from your perspective in your ministry, you think can be done to further access to justice, acknowledging what you said. We don't want harsher penalties, we don't want harsher laws, but what additional avenues can the government help to facilitate or open up or improve that would get us there?
So, just to indicate, so a lot of people will clamor for harsher penalties, harsher laws and everything, and that's fine, but it still doesn't take us where we want to go.
Got
That's the
you.
point. So even if we get there, it still, or when we do, it still doesn't cure the problem.
Right.
All right, so take, for example, we've opened one shelter at the Ministry of Gender, and this is a shelter. For the first time in our history, we now have a shelter. We have 2 more to open where battered women can actually go. They can now escape the abuse that is happening there. So again, these take, it takes resources. And when I looked at the report, one of the recommendations was more funding to create awareness and also to provide an avenue. So a lady who is being battered by her husband, the justice for her is not him going to prison or being locked up, etc., in terms of what she wants as a society. The justice from the society level, at the social level, says, yes, you must be apprehended and you must be locked up, etc., etc. But the justice she wants is a safer environment for her and for her children. The justice she wants is financial independence. The justice she wants is to be able to negotiate sex, and not put herself at risk. Even when we speak about persons living with HIV, there are women who have been infected with HIV, because a partner who goes out there, he catches AIDS by whatever means, and he then forces himself upon her. Or a woman is being raped and she catches HIV or whatever other sexual transmitted disease within the process. So the justice for them is a softer society where they have that avenue to escape. We're looking at the sexual harassment bill. Of course, that is going to that is before Parliament to be sent to Joint Select Committee. The Offences Against the Persons Act, that is before Joint Select Committee as well, because again, we recognize the need to change the laws. I looked at the report and it spoke about health discrimination and how do we amend the charter or look at the Constitution to ensure that discrimination on the basis of health status does in fact become a law. So things like that will help. I recall being in England, and England has very progressive laws, but that's another story.
Thank you so much, Mr. Hines. For you, what more?
Actually, Dion, if a lot more, I was just about to say joined up work at the community level, because so much is happening there, and people's experiences about access or lack of, and maybe some of what is deemed as lack of access, maybe just lack of information about where to find access to justice. And therefore,
so you agree with Mrs. Cuthbert Flynn on that then?
Absolutely. Absolutely. There needs to be more information in ways that persons can readily assimilate the information. I don't think a billboard is effective for some person. I think they need to know how we talk with people on the ground and what is it that they will understand, what language. So joined up work at that level to help persons to find different avenues, because part of our culture is that we have so much ingrained violence in our DNA that it's easy to use violence in a domestic situation or against persons who we don't like, or we think that they look the wrong color or the wrong height or they're mad or they're LGBT or whatever. So we use violence because it's part of who we are. So I'm saying joined up work at that level can begin to address it. It's not going to happen overnight, but it needs to start there.
Okay, so Just processing in terms of what you said and how that fits in. So you're kind of linking what Mr. Terrelonge said with what Mrs. Cuthbert Flynn said as well.
Yeah, just so long as it provides persons an opportunity to get to mediation and to use some of those ADR processes that they can, no access in, but they should be having access to them.
Okay.
Yes.
Mrs. Harrison Henry.
Thank you, Dion. One of the reasons I like to come to these occasions is because there's always a segment on the community where people get the opportunity to talk about their real life experiences. And I think that justice needs to be available, and the means by which someone accesses justice should be readily available to communities. And I'll break that down a little more. Shelters, as my learned colleague mentioned, those are important aspects of justice. But there should be institutionalization of offices and places within our communities that people having a problem can say, I better go over wherever it is and get some advice or some help. So we need to have institutions across the island. Re-socialization of persons.
Just before you move on, would that place be adequately situated in a police station, or is that the wrong place?
Absolutely not. It's an independent location.
Okay.
Where...
and I see Mr. Hines shaking his head no as well.
Where...
Everybody says no.
An independent location where... that provides services. Dion, as you well know, that services relating to psychological hurt is something that we deal with at our office, though we are not equipped to in terms of a full complement of staff, but we do have one social worker who assists us greatly. The fact of the matter is that there is need for greater advocacy across the island as to persons' entitlement to justice. And justice can mean a number of different things to people. The access, however, is very important. It needs to be a place where the communities understand that this is what happens at this location. And there is need for greater advocacy, not only for rights, but also for people to know possible remedies. So I would really recommend a broadening of the space for justice outcomes for Jamaicans.
Yeah, I'd love to. We're going to run out of time, but I want to dig into that a little bit more because I think it's such an interesting idea, and I'd love any other panelists to comment on that.
I just want to comment on what was just said, and I think the justice centers that Minister Glenroy Chuck is now pushing in different communities. I know that from my community in Stony Hill that we are supposed to get one, and there are quite a number of justice centers that are open. I think the EU also donated a mobile unit to actually serve Jamaicans on different levels, varying levels, so that justice can be served to them. And so I think that is one way that the government is actually taking some sort of an action to say, look, we're going to be putting these justice centers in the different communities, not just in Kingston, Jamaica, that everybody think that Kingston is Jamaica, but they're being built right across the island. And I think that is what I want to see more of, because I think everyone in here from different places in Jamaica can say, look, they've possibly gotten calls from persons who are being abused or who feel some sort of a discrimination or want some sort of dispute resolution. And this is a space that they don't have to take a bus from here to go into Kingston or into wherever, into the town center to get that justice. So I think that is something I know that the government is doing, and I think we just need more of those centers. Of course, the financial constraint now, but I think that is one way that justice can be served, and we need to see more of those.
Yes, everybody wanting to jump in on this. So in order of who's, I saw put up the mic first, Glenroy, then Paul, then then Alando.
My point is very quick. I think also when we think about those justice centers, anything that's nationwide but community-based, we have to also guard against the difficulties that come with the healthcare center, which is, because it's in my community, then my business will be spread because people will know what I go there for. So you still have to kind of engage that kind of training and sensitivity so that whosoever is working in those justice centers has those kinds of sensibilities, especially with communities that prize anonymity and being able to talk about what happens to them in safe ways. I mean, the other side of that, though, and it's something I comment on, is we have to get our communities at a point where they can openly talk about who they are and what they've experienced. Because the truth is, you can't talk, even if we had anti-discrimination laws, if you can't name your discrimination because you can't name yourself, then it's meaningless. And so more work needs to happen then to get these communities to be able to name themselves and name what has happened to them. And that also is a part of the investment that we as civil society and government will have to do so that these persons in these communities feel like they can name themselves.
I want to say that there are many tributaries that make up a stream. And in every community, there's a church. So I'm just saying that justice centers, I am in complete support, but I think that there are more churches than justice centers. And maybe we need to find a way to incorporate the churches to provide the space in the communities that will allow the people in communities that are having issues to have a space that is safe and therefore have greater access.
Let me ask you though, what about the very real problem that, and I know the problem when we talk about the church is that there is no such homogeneous entity, but people have had very real problems with breach of confidence and judgment and all kinds of very negative reactions when they go to seek justice and seek succor in the walls of some of these churches. So
Right.
can that not be
A barrier.
almost a dangerous proposition, because the church, you know, have people and participants who are coming from so very many different perspectives and ideologies and beliefs, and some of whom believe that the person who is walking through their door asking for help, members of these communities, are inherently sinful and inherently problematic. So they might be getting the help, but getting it with judgment or all kinds of strictures that are very unhelpful to people in these situations. How do you deal with that?
Forgive me for not being clear. I wasn't asking the churches to do it. I was asking for access to their structures and their buildings.
Got you. Got you. Thank you so
Right.
much. Mr. Terrelonge. Let me just let Mr. Terrelonge go first.
So, again, I'm going to recommend increased funding to train counselors, peer educators, more social workers, and of course, psychiatrists, psychologists, etc. Jamaica has a very short supply of persons with the requisite psychological training that would help with the healing process of it all. And I make the point again, you know, I mean, listen, you could make every single law on the book, but that sort of the mental damage that victims suffer to feel whole again, you know, that requires another level of intervention at the socio-psychological level. And even when we speak about breaking negative stereotypes or unlearning negative stereotypes and just the sort of re-socialization, re-education, we must have, at the community level, more counselors, more social workers who can go into the communities, because you're going to build justice centers, and who is going to be there? Because again, the kind of justice that people want is just the freedom to be, the freedom to exist. You know, so, and I'll say it this way, you have young girls who are afraid to go to, who are afraid to go to the pharmacy to get a pill, or the morning after pill, or whatever. You have young men who feel don't mind how you hear the Jamaican man them talk a road and, oh, yeah man. They are still afraid to go into the pharmacy to act to buy the condom. Yes. You know, so imagine someone living with HIV who is going to go to the pharmacy to say, to disclose the status and to give the prescription to get the medicine. So it's a lot of psychological trauma, a lot of psychological help that persons also need. So when we look at the victim support unit, and and our ministry has them, but again, more funding to assist with victim support and more funding to assist with the social workers and the counselors at the community and the school level to deal with that re-socialization. So again, sex, church, education, that's another discussion. Dion.
Before we go to the public defender, someone in the audience had wanted to make a comment or a question. Let me go to him.
It's both a comment and a question. I like where the ministers are going in terms of re-socialization, re-education. But a problem that I find, that I have, the Gender Affairs Bureau still has, under their definition of gender, male and female. And we have signed, I think Jamaica has signed on to the treaties with the UN in terms of recognition of all classifications of gender, and yet we are still archaic in our thinking. And the Planning Institute of Jamaica, in their Vision 2030 document, there's no reference to even the discussion of classifications of gender and how we are going to deal with that. And if we're moving into Vision 2030, where nobody is left behind, and persons don't even understand what being heterosexual is, or what the different classifications of gender. I want to know from you what is going to be done and where is your thinking on all of this?
All right, thank you much. I think that's for Mr. Terrelonge, and then I know we have another question from the audience, and then I'll go to the public defender, and then I think we'll wrap up.
The short answer, greater engagement with civil society and the society at large.
In terms of why we're still looking at gender in a binary way, I think that's what he's asking. Is that something that's going to be reconsidered or at least discussed?
I just think that he has the right to express himself and to express his views.
Okay. So just to jump in, I think the truth is with transgender-related recognition and issues that it's. In civil society, we just started working on it about 5 or 4 years ago. And there are many in civil society who don't fully understand the realities facing the trans community. So I agree with Minister Cuthbert Flynn that there's a lot of engagement that needs to happen for it to get to the level of policy. And that it would be difficult for anybody in any ministry to just put it in any policy or planning document. There's a lot of work to be done. I have to give thanks to the Ministry of Health, for example, in the ways they've been engaging the transgender community around recognition, around at least providing a space for them to access care. And I think continued engagement is what will build it out to where we would like to see it.
I'm in agreement. I think here we are talking about discrimination on this level, and we're trying to take it to another level. And so Jamaicans first have to understand discrimination, period, and what that means. And so you have to have serious conversation in Jamaica. As you know, Jamaica don't want you to just throw something on them. They will rile up. And so I think we need to first discuss, and again, the Ministry of Health, we definitely preach to not discriminate against, to make sure that persons living with HIV and AIDS, that they are accessing care, that they are coming to care, that we're trying to find everyone out there who is HIV positive to make sure that they come in, and all the different NGOs in Jamaica, they are working hard and working with the ministry to make sure that we are not discriminating. And even during the COVID-19, the initial outbreak that we had, persons made sure that, there are persons in communities living with HIV who are actually working with JASL and other organizations to make sure that persons who are afraid or fearful, that they are getting their medication. So I think we have to work, work this out first before we can start talking about transgender and getting into that as far as, other things in Jamaica. So I think we have a ways to go, but yes, we're looking at other countries and we're in a global space, but I think we have to first look at our country and where we are.
Let me go to the public defender had wanted to make a comment before I go back to the final comment from the floor.
So what I wanted to say is these justice centers, which I'm aware of, the establishment, the proposal came out of the 2007 Justice Reform Task Force. And the fact is that neither administration, this one or the past, in my humble opinion, has paid adequate attention or provided adequate resources for securing justice and access to justice. And I strongly believe that, because sometimes we're not able to see the interlinkages between justice and economic growth and life in the community. With these centers that have already been established, we hold the view that what is critical for the growth and development of Jamaica is strong communities. We believe in working in communities. The resocialization, all of that is fine, but we believe that the groundwork has to be done at the community level, where these justice centers are respected, they are run in a neutral and independent manner, where confidence is reposed in them for people to utilize the service, along with civil society. I just make one final point. In our submissions in relation to the National Human Rights Institute, which, so far as we know, has not yet received cabinet approval, one of the things that we emphasized is the need for the involvement of civil society in such an institution. It has to be a joining of hands at the community level. Leadership at the very top has to signal we will not tolerate stigma and discrimination. The signal has to come from the top.
Okay, thank you so much. Final comment from the floor. Microphone.
Sorry, Dion, while the microphone is being passed, just to indicate that, when we speak about justice and discrimination in Jamaica, the Prime Minister speaks frequently about building a progressive society where persons are not discriminated against. So I would say that there is leadership at the very top, where it's a merit-based society, or certainly what we have been doing is trying to create a very merit-based government, a very merit-based society that is free from discrimination. And as a government, we have been speaking very openly about that. When you take the motion brought on abortion by Minister Justice Flynn, I mean, I'm sure there are persons who were in shock or not, but she was free to do so. You know, I mean, and I sat in the committee again, and I sat there freely, you know, and I could refer to things that I was, I mean, I remember my first article in 2013, abolishing our antiquated abortion laws. And we've been free to express ourselves. When I write about locks and I speak to the Prime Minister about locks and discrimination, I mean, we completely understand, because we want all our Jamaican citizens to have that true Jamaican experience, for Jamaica really to be the choice of place to live, work, do business, and our Prime Minister adds, and to retire for all Jamaicans.
Thank you so much. Go ahead for me.
Okay. So we're looking on, this question is there to Mr. Terrelonge. So our World AIDS Day team said global solidarity and shared responsibility. And I heard you mention something about more funding to educate, peer educators, counselors. But to you, Mr. Terrelonge, send these funds to the NGOs. They have a lot of peer educators. Me, myself, is a peer educator, and I work at E4 Life. And when we go into the schools, we reach a lot of children that a regular guidance counselor in the school is not reaching. We get down to the children's level, and we speak to them from our hearts. Sometimes the kids are going through so much, and the teachers don't understand. They claim them as bad. But we who understand, we talk to them, and then we can share with those guidance counselors what their gap is. So I would implore you, put the funding to the NGOs. They can assist you there, sir.
And you know, I share your passion. I really share your passion, because in my own engagements, I try my best to educate society, or certainly my followers, and even and when I speak, Dion, you know, it's to give. I can draw on my own experiences, you know, and just to say that, well, yes, we need to reach out to our young persons, and that's where the resocialization starts, and that's why I mentioned, you know, sex, church, and education. But you know, from a gender perspective, we do have gender ambassadors, and we've been working with the Ministry of Education. And what I will say is that more work needs to be done for that partnership between our ministry as a gender ministry and the Ministry of Education, to get more gender ambassadors within our schools, just to speak about these very things, in questions of, you know, respect for self and respect for others. And finally, we haven't mentioned it as yet, and I think it's important for us to know that as a government, we have passed 2017 the National Strategic Action Plan to end violence, and also to end gender-based violence. So we are a progressive government, you know, with progressive members of parliament, and we believe we believe in building a better Jamaica for all Jamaicans.
All right, I was going to end, but Glenroy is begging. 30 seconds.
Easily. So I think what the report, doing while I was compiling, a part of the team compiling the report, what it showed me is that we also have to be careful of the impetus to replace government. We must complement what you're doing. At JFLAG, I can never have the reach of police. And when persons come to me asking to essentially investigate their cases, I can't do that. We don't have the resources to do that. Would we like government support to do some of our work? Absolutely. But it must be understanding that we're complementing you in the gaps. So we train healthcare workers to provide the services, because I am not a doctor. And that's the approach that I must always caution, that it must be complementary and collaboratory. It can't, so it's send funding to civil society, but send funding to civil society in tandem with, in collaboration with, synergizing what government is doing.
All right, I think that's a great final comment. You know, this event comes at such an important time for the advocacy community. Yesterday, of course, November 25 is International Day for Elimination of Violence Against Women, which begins the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. December 1, National AIDS Day, falls within that time period, and it ends, of course, on December 10, which is International Human Rights Day. So there are so many issues and concerns and important issues facing our society that intersect during this period of time that we all need to be grappling with. Thank you so much. I think the panel has been wonderful, passionate and informed and expert, and we look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you all so very much. I'll hand you back over to Mr. Lalo.
Thank you very much, Dion. Panelists. You know, a very rich discussion. I'm very Thank you very much, panelists. Thank you. We are going to move on with the program, so I'm going to invite the Monitoring and Evaluation Manager from Jamaica Aid Support for Life, Mr. Xavier Biggs, to move the vote of thanks.
So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It seems our panelists are leaving. I'll allow a minute for that to happen. Or they could wait to be thanked. So, I'll tell you, it's interesting. The important work of moving the world forward does not wait to be done by perfect men. It is in recognizing our flaws that we are best able to course correct and make the appropriate plans for the future. And so the dialogue that we've been able to have today is very, very critical to the way forward. And so it's my duty to say a thanks to everyone who participated in the process and helped to make today possible. So I want to start firstly by saying a very big thank you to the key populations of men and women, including persons living with HIV. We thank you for allowing us into your lives and sharing your stories with us. Everything we do and hope to accomplish from this rides on your bravery and willingness to speak on the issues. To the team of researchers from Jamaicans for Justice, we make special mention of Roger Malcolm, Morgan Phillips, and Ornella Kelly, and also Mr. Glenroy Murray. We are thankful for your support in that regard. To our NGO and civil society partners, we remain grateful for your support and we remain grateful for the support you continue to provide to key and vulnerable populations. And I want to make very, very special mention of the Jamaican Network of Seropositives, Jamaicans for Justice, and the Equality Foundation, specifically, who provided data on the different human rights violations that were documented and formed the basis for the research that we were able to present today. To my team at the Jamaica Aid Support for Life, that's my team, Mikkel, Mrs. Walton Levermore, Jerome, Chad, Ron, Patrick, Jade, Gala, everyone who works in the Environment and Human Rights Department. I've seen the hours, I see the late evenings, I see the late nights. Your efforts have shown in today's activity. Kudos to you. And of course, we couldn't do all of what we were able to do without the funding support of the European Union. And so we want to say a very big thank you to them as well. Today in particular, we've had some very excellent presentations. We are thankful to our guests. Minister Terrelonge, thank you. Mrs. Cuthbert, Flynn, Minister, thank you. Also, again, Mr. Murray, thanks. Mr. Paul Hines. Madam Public Defender, thank you. We are UNAIDS and, Ruben, I see you. Thank you very much. Frederick left, but thank you too for sharing your morning into afternoon with us. Phase 3, we see you.
Thank you for making today possible. I see our media colleagues, much appreciated. Mr. Cruikshank, blessings and light to you. And to our host, Mrs. Dion Jackson Miller, thank you. Today was an excellent, excellent showing, and we look forward to other great opportunities.
Ladies and gentlemen, I just want to say as we close and as we leave, I want everyone to consider the challenges of access to justice that we heard shared by our key and vulnerable populations here this morning. And I want you to think about the role you play in your own space, wherever that is, towards improving access to justice, or if the role that you are playing is making it worse, how do you assess your role as we try to improve access for all persons here? Access to justice is extremely important, and we want to thank everyone for being here today. And as we leave, remember, the motto we want you to leave here with today is justice for one, justice for all. Thank you very much. Have a good afternoon.